The first ash of the unfinished West, the dust was the color of old blood and regret. It settled over Cedar Valley like a shroud woven from memory and unmet promise. It coated the window panes of Eliza Kincaid's sod house, dulling the morning light into a perpetual, weary twilight. The year was 1898, and the West, far from being conquered, felt only half-built. A grand experiment left to rust and rot under the indifferent sun. This was the inheritance of Eliza's family, and of every settler who had taken the bait of free land and boundless opportunity. A stubborn, unforgiving piece of America where the only thing guaranteed was hard work and the occasional spectacular failure. They called it Cedar Valley for the sparse, defiant juniper trees that clung to the hillsides, but mostly it was just dirt and sky, a canvas too large for any single human to truly paint upon. Eliza, at 27, carried the history of this place in the stiff set of her shoulders. She was built for endurance, not delicacy. Her hands were calloused from handling the plow reins, the loom, and, recently, the heavy account ledgers. Her father, Thomas, had brought them here a decade ago, chasing the fever dream of prosperity. He was a man of fierce belief, but belief was a poor substitute for water when the wells ran dry. Today, the first ash was a fresh, stinging reality. 2 weeks ago, a fire sparked by a stray ember from a passing stagecoach had swept through the newly built northern section of the Kincaids' long fence line. It was a minor disaster. 20 rods of cedar post and barbed wire reduced to charcoal dust, but it felt monumental. It was the first tangible proof that their foothold in the valley was fragile, that one moment of carelessness could undo months of toil. The scent of that scorched wood still lingered, a phantom warning. Eliza stood at the kitchen counter, rubbing a copper penny between her thumb and forefinger. She was calculating the cost of replacement posts, subtracting the total from the meager reserve they had set aside for seeds. The numbers refused to balance. It was a problem the West presented daily: how to mend one hole without tearing another. "Eliza, are you staring at that copper again?" Her mother, Sarah, a woman whose former softness had been etched away by prairie life, stood framed in the doorway, a bowl of coarse oatmeal in her hands. Sarah had never loved the West. She saw it not as a chance for freedom, but as a slow, deliberate exile from the civilized life she cherished. "Just counting, Mama. Thinking on the costs of being unfinished." Sarah placed the bowl down with a sharp clatter. "Don't use your father's grand words for simple poverty, dear. It was a fire. We rebuild. We always do." Eliza looked past her mother, towards the small iron-banded chest that sat on the mantel. On top of it always was the lantern. It wasn't the brightest nor the newest. It was a heavy old railway lantern, brass tarnished green, its glass flue faintly smoked. It had belonged to Thomas's grandfather, a track foreman, and had survived more train wrecks and storms than any Kincaid. Thomas insisted on keeping the wick trimmed and the oil fresh. He lit it every evening, placing it precisely on the porch railing, regardless of whether a storm was raging or the moon was full. To him, the lantern was more than a light. It was an oath. "The West is unfinished, Eliza," he had told her when she was 12, watching him scrape clay from the glass. "Not because we haven't built enough, but because we haven't decided what it is yet. Is it a kingdom of dirt barons or a commonwealth of free men? That's the question. And it's the answer, too. It's the constant work of being decent when the world asks you to be brutal." But the brutality was winning. The land itself seemed to favor the large and the ruthless. The nearby Blackwood Syndicate, a corporate monolith controlled by the distant railway king, Silas Vance, was slowly swallowing up all the prime acreage along the river. Vance didn't care about homesteads. He cared about control, about shipping lanes and mineral rights. Every small farmer in Cedar Valley was fighting not just the elements, but an unseen enemy with bottomless pockets. Eliza took the penny and dropped it back into the bowl of its brethren. She decided not to tell her mother about the Cale property yet. Cale, a neighbor old man who had arrived in the valley before anyone, was Thomas's closest friend. But Cale had succumbed to an illness in the last dry spell, and his land, a vital parcel that abutted the river, was now an easy target for the syndicate. That was the true ash. The burning away of the community's spirit with every failure, every death, every forced retreat. "I'm going to see the miller," Eliza announced, tying a bonnet under her chin. "We need flour, and maybe he'll take a partial payment for the mill run last week." "You shouldn't go alone," Sarah protested, the familiar worry lines deepening. "It's only 2 miles. Mama, the danger isn't from raiders anymore. It's from starvation." Eliza grabbed her shawl. Stepping out, the air was surprisingly still, heavy with the weight of the coming day. The only sound was the distant, rhythmic clang of a hammer, the Blackwood Syndicate's surveyors driving stakes into the ground, marking the next chunk of appropriated land. They hammered, not with urgency, but with the arrogant certainty of ownership. As she walked along the rough track, Eliza passed the charred remains of the fence. The scorched earth felt soft and dead under her boots. She bent down and picked up a piece of the black charcoal, its fine soot staining her palm. This was the West, a place where effort was quickly erased, leaving only residue. She thought of Cale's land, the lush grasses along the riverbank that the syndicate was eyeing. If they took Cale's parcel, they would gain control of the only reliable water source for the entire western side of the valley. It would be a chokehold. The promise of the unfinished West, a place for everyone, would die right there. Halfway to the mill, she saw him, Caleb Kincaid, her older brother, sat atop his bay mare Justice near the border of their property. Caleb was the physical embodiment of the West's promise, tall, lean, with eyes that perpetually scanned the horizon. Unlike Thomas, who fought with ideals, or Eliza, who fought with numbers, Caleb was a man of action. He had been away for 2 years, working as a hired hand on a huge ranch further north, sending back money, but offering no details about his life. He returned 3 days ago unexpectedly, drawn back by news of the fire and perhaps by the deeper unspoken troubles. He slid down from Justice, his boots kicking up a small swirl of the ever-present dust. "Heading to town?" he asked, his voice low and seasoned by the open air. "To the miller's, trying to trade promises for bread." Caleb nodded, his gaze fixed on the syndicate's surveyors, who were now clearly visible on the northern ridge. He didn't need to ask what the hammer strokes meant. "I rode out this morning," he said, pulling a length of fresh hemp rope from his saddlebag. "I saw what the fire did, and I saw the markings around Cale's lot." "The syndicate is moving fast," Eliza confirmed, brushing the ash from her hand onto her denim skirt. "If we can't hold them off until the claim officially lapses, they'll jump the title. We need to petition the territorial office, but the nearest office is a week's ride, and the agent there is Vance's man." Caleb looked at her, his expression unreadable. "A week's ride is too long, Elle. That land is the valley's throat. If Vance takes it, we all choke." He took the rope and began slowly, meticulously, braiding a short section. It was a habit from his ranching days, a calming exercise. "What did you learn up north, Caleb?" Eliza asked softly. "Did you find the finished West? The place where the land gives way without a fight?" He paused, the rope tight between his fingers. He looked at the vast, desolate horizon, the true, unending nature of the West that lay beyond their valley. "I found a West that was finished, all right," Caleb said, his voice flat. It was finished for the ranchers who drove their herds across hundreds of miles, only to find Vance had bought the water rights ahead of them. It was finished for the small farmers whose crops were ruined by the railroad's smoke and whose land was bought for pennies. "The West isn't about building, Eliza, it's about taking. And the only thing they respect is something they can't break." He held up the small, tightly woven knot in the rope, a perfect monkey's fist. "We need to give them something they can't break." Violence? Eliza felt a chill despite the rising heat. No, not yet. Thomas wouldn't stand for that. But we need a visible symbol, a refusal, something they have to look at every single day. They walked the rest of the way in silence, the air thick with unspoken plans. When they reached the cluster of buildings that passed for Cedar Valley's commercial center, the miller's barn, the general store, and a single unpainted church. Eliza saw the fear in the faces of the few people milling about. They knew the syndicate was closing in. They saw the first ash on their own hands, too. After securing a promise of flour, Eliza hurried back, finding Thomas in the backyard, hammering new fence posts. He was working with furious, desperate energy. "I saw Caleb," she said, handing him a canteen. Thomas straightened, wiping sweat from his brow. "He's back to stay, I think." "Good. A strong back is needed." He said, "We need a refusal against the syndicate. Something they can't break." Thomas swung the hammer and buried a post deep into the ground. "He's right. That's why I'm fixing this fence. It's our refusal. But the fence is just wood, Papa. Vance will buy us out or starve us out. Cale's land is the key. We have to secure it before it lapses." Thomas stopped working. He looked at the newly driven post, then at the vast, empty plain. "Cale and I had an arrangement. An old man's promise, not a legal document. But Cale never trusted lawyers. He trusted the light." He walked over to the porch and reached for the lantern. He held it, polishing the brass with his sleeve until it shone. "Eliza, go inside. Get the old deed box from the chest, the one with the brass clasp, and bring the can of fresh whale oil." Eliza obeyed, her heart thumping against her ribs. The deed box was heavy and smelled of dried sage and old parchment. When she returned, Thomas had the lantern disassembled. "This lantern," Thomas said, his voice quiet, serious. "It's been with us through 3 states, through hunger and flood. It's never gone out." He took the oldest parchment from the box. Not a deed, but the original Kincaid claim petition, signed by his great-grandfather. He carefully rolled it up, tied it with Caleb's freshly knotted hemp rope, and secured it inside the lantern's empty oil reservoir. He then filled the glass flue with the fresh oil, poured only a tiny amount into the base where the wick sat, and relit the lamp, trimming the wick until the flame was tiny, perfect and steady. Tomorrow, Vance's surveyor, Mr. Hemlock, is due to finish marking Cale's land. Caleb and I will be there. We can't beat them in the courts today, but we can beat them in the eyes of the valley. What will you do?" Eliza whispered. Thomas looked at the glowing brass, the small, persistent light. "We'll give them the ultimate refusal. L. We will give them something so stubborn, so rooted in the spirit of this land, that they will have to destroy the entire notion of the West to put it out." The sun finally broke over the eastern ridge, but it felt weak, unable to penetrate the heaviness of the dust. Yet the small flame in Thomas's hand, the lantern that kept burning, cast a ridiculously bright, defiant circle of light in the dusty yard. This was the opening volley. The ashes were settled, the lie was known, and the true fight for the soul of the unfinished West was about to begin on a desolate, crucial piece of riverland. Eliza watched her father and brother prepare for the dawn. The light in the lantern's glass was steady, fueled by just enough oil to last the night, but kept alive by something far deeper than fuel. It was the first resolute glimmer against the vast shadow of the syndicate, the unwavering stand against the inevitability of the first ash. She knew then that the fate of Cedar Valley would be decided not by the size of the Kincaids' guns or the depth of their pockets, but by the stubbornness of that single, unwavering flame. The true dawn was not the sun's rising, but the moment they chose to refuse the darkness. Apnar nirdesh anusare. Agergo perdhara bahikta eksa kre, the promise on the prairie wind. Saptaitel bibhar kare 1800 glapti in rejite terikra halo. The promise on the prairie wind. The prairie wind was rarely a comforting presence in Cedar Valley. It was a tireless thief, snatching moisture from the soil, tearing shingles from roofs, and carrying the biting scent of distant alkali flats. Yet on the morning after the first ash fire, the wind carried something else, a subtle, sharp thrill of defiance. It was the air of expectation that settles over a place just before a community decides to risk everything. Eliza Kincaid, dressed in her most practical skirt and a heavy buttoned waistcoat, watched her father. Thomas and her brother Caleb preparing to leave. The lantern, its brass now meticulously polished, rested on the seat of the Kincaid wagon, its tiny flame barely visible in the bright glare of the morning sun. yet pulsing with an insistent inner light. Their destination was the old Kale homestead, 2 miles north, a crucial piece of land with prime river access that the Blackwood Syndicate aimed to seize. The syndicate's surveyor, Mr. Hemlock, was scheduled to arrive at 10 o'clock to legally mark the boundaries of what he assumed would soon be Vance's property. "Remember the plan." "Thomas," Eliza reminded her father, her voice taut with anxiety. "Hemlock is a lawyer, not a fighter. He follows the letter of the law. You have to make him acknowledge the lantern's presence as a legitimate claim marker." Thomas Kincaid nodded, pulling his hat low. "A silent marker, El. The promise of an unfinished claim." Cale always said his best land deed was his word, but since his tongue is silent, we'll let this old light speak for him. Caleb, already mounted on Justice, checked the action on the rifle strapped to his saddle. "And if Hemlock brings the law with him, he won't bring the marshal for a simple surveying job," Thomas replied, climbing into the wagon. "But if he brings Vance's hired hands, we stand our ground, son. We are on Cale's land, making a witness." As the wagon wheels began to turn, grinding through the dusty track, Eliza felt a sudden, profound loneliness. In the West, every departure felt like a potential goodbye. "I'll ride to the Millers," she called out, though she knew her true intent was to ride further, to warn the few close neighbors who might stand with them. "I'll be back before noon." The 2-mile journey to the Kyle property was less a ride and more a slow, tense processional. Thomas drove the wagon deliberately, his eyes scanning the horizon not for game, but for the glint of iron, the symbol of the syndicate's encroachment. When they reached the designated spot, a small rise, overlooking the winding river, they found Mr. Hemlock already there. Hemlock was precisely as Eliza had described, a small, dry man in an ill-fitting tweed suit, more accustomed to reading fine print than prairie maps. He stood beside 2 of Vance's hired hands, hulking men named Buck and Ike, whose faces were as hard and unforgiving as the granite they sometimes blasted. They had arrived early, confident of their quick legal conquest. Hemlock consulted his ledger, adjusting his spectacles. "Kincaid, I assume you are here to witness the legal surveying of the defunct Cale claim as per the Territorial Office's notice?" Thomas carefully climbed off the wagon, clutching the lantern. Caleb remained mounted, a silent, imposing figure on Justice, the rifle always visible. "I am here to honor a standing agreement, Hemlock," Thomas said, his voice ringing clearly on the wind. "A claim for the perpetual promise of this land, witnessed by the man who built it." Hemlock sighed, annoyed by the rhetoric. "Mr. Cale is deceased, Kincaid. The land is therefore classified as unclaimed and undeveloped. Under territorial law, after 90 days of inactivity, the claim can be legally reopened by the most active interest, which is the Blackwood Syndicate." "And when does that 90 days officially lapse, Hemlock?" Caleb cut in, his voice deep and steady. Hemlock fumbled with his papers. "Tomorrow at noon, but the survey must be completed today to validate the syndicate's filing." "Then you are premature," Thomas declared. He walked straight to the heart of the contested area, a small, flat space near the river's edge. He hammered a fresh, sturdy cedar post deep into the soil. Then, with deliberate slowness, he carefully set the lantern atop the post. The light was a tiny, improbable spark in the immense. "Open air! This lantern," Thomas announced, facing the surveyor, "holds a notarized copy of Elias Cale's original claim petition. Inside, in place of oil, rests the very first deed of this land. It is sealed with the Cale family crest and witnessed by myself. This was a lie, crafted for the law. The paper inside was Thomas's great-grandfather's deed, but the appearance of a legal formality was what mattered. Furthermore," Thomas continued, his voice gaining strength, defying the wind, "Cale and I made a verbal agreement, witnessed by the community, that should he pass before the valley was truly settled, I would maintain his claim until his son, wherever he may be, returned to claim his inheritance. This lantern is the physical marker of that unfinished agreement. It is the visible promise. Under the common law of the prairie, a burning light marks a claim currently being maintained." Hemlock scoffed. "A verbal agreement and an old lamp? You are challenging a corporate legal filing with folklore, Kincaid." I am challenging a paper lie with a visible truth, Thomas retorted, pointing to the flickering flame. That light is currently burning. It marks a maintained claim. If you stake the syndicate's claim within the radius of that light, you are legally interfering with an active, visible operation. You are trespassing. Hemlock hesitated. He was paid to navigate paper trails, not prairie customs. A legal challenge based on an active visual marker, however ridiculous, could delay the filing. And delay was the syndicate's enemy. The two hired hands, Buck and Ike, exchanged a look. Buck, the larger one, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. Looks like an old lamp on a stick to me, mister, Buck growled, taking a menacing step toward the post. We'll just move your promise aside, and then Hemlock can draw his line. Caleb moved Justice sideways, placing the horse directly between Buck and the post. The mare snorted, agitated by the man's hostility. You touch that marker, and you are actively destroying private property, Caleb said, his hand resting lightly on the rifle. That is a crime, regardless of who wins the land. He said we need a refusal against the syndicate, something they can't break. Thomas swung the hammer and buried a post deep into the ground. He's right. That's why I'm fixing this fence. It's our refusal. The tension was a palpable thing, stretched thin across the prairie. The vast, empty landscape suddenly felt suffocatingly small. Hold on! Hemlock squeaked, stepping back from the conflict. He was horrified by the prospect of violence which would instantly complicate the legal matter. Buck, Ike, stand down. We will not resort to extra-legal means. Kincaid, you leave me no choice. I must consult the marshal. Do that, Thomas said calmly, adjusting the small vent on the lantern. And when you return, that light will still be burning, proving my continuous claim. Every hour you delay is an hour I maintain this land, as Cale requested. The promise on the prairie wind, Hemlock, is stubbornness. Defeated by the Kincaid's audacious legal theater, Hemlock packed his instruments. With a final furious glance at the flickering brass marker, he and the hired hands mounted up and rode away towards the territorial office. The syndicate's arrogance momentarily checked. That afternoon, as the news of the standoff spread, Eliza visited every homestead in Cedar Valley. The miller, the blacksmith, the two surviving members of the Swedish contingent, all had heard the tale of the lantern. They are coming back. Eliza, the miller whispered, flour dust clinging to his eyebrows. Not just Hemlock. The marshal, maybe. Vance won't stand for public humiliation? I know, Eliza replied, but Thomas and Caleb can't hold the line alone. If the marshal comes, we need witnesses. We need the promise to be communal. This was the true heart of the promise on the prairie wind, the deep, often buried bond between neighbors who had survived the West together. They were small farmers, their futures dependent on a shared water source. Cale's land was their lifeblood. What if we lose the land anyway? The blacksmith asked, his voice heavy with cynicism. We are small, Eliza. Vance is an empire. We will lose the land eventually if we fight alone, she countered. But if we lose it fighting together, we keep something more important, the right to speak the truth on our own soil. The promise is not just the land, but the community we build upon it. By sunset, a dozen men and women from the valley agreed to stand with the Kincaids. They would arrive before dawn to form a non-violent cordon around the lantern. Eliza returned home, the last rays of sun painting the western sky in hues of orange and violent purple. She found Thomas not at the Cale property, but in their own backyard, working on a complex piece of rigging. He was reinforcing the glass flue of the lantern with a mesh of fine wire and setting a protective wooden cage around the entire post. They will try to break it, Elle, Thomas said without looking up. The light itself. They won't want the violence of shooting Caleb, but they will want the quiet violence of smashing the claim. They won't risk destroying property in front of the marshal, Eliza said, attempting to reassure him. They'll pay the fine later, Thomas corrected, tightening a screw. But the law requires continuous maintenance of the claim. If the light goes out, the claim is defunct. He lifted the lamp, its flame now perfectly sheltered. It was a beacon of stubborn hope, yes, but also a ridiculously fragile focus for so much power and greed. It's not just the wire, Papa, Eliza said, looking at the tiny flame. What if the wind blows the chimney off? Or the oil runs out? Thomas smiled faintly. The oil is fresh, and the promise is what fuels it now. We've stood up to the syndicate, and that news is already traveling the wind. Even if we lose the land, we've shown them that Cedar Valley can fight back. That is the true promise, Eliza, that we will never stop building this unfinished West in the way we believe it should be built. That night, Eliza sat on the porch railing. The prairie was quiet, save for the incessant rush of the wind. She could just make out the tiny, distant glow of the lantern at the Kale homestead. It was a minuscule point of orange in a sea of black, but it held the concentrated will of every settler in the valley. The wind suddenly intensified, howling across the empty miles. It shook the sod house, rattling the window panes. Eliza gripped the porch railing, her heart pounding. She imagined the wind reaching the lantern, battering the fragile glass and the determined flame. She thought of the promise, the dream of a commonwealth, of free land, of dignity over greed. It was a promise that could be extinguished in an instant by a single gust of the prairie wind or by the crushing weight of Silas Vance's millions. But the light held. It flickered wildly, threatening to vanish, but the reinforced casing and Thomas's careful trimming kept it alive. As the wind finally lessened and dawn began to touch the eastern sky, Eliza stood up. She saw the first dark shapes of the neighbors riding toward the Kale property. The light was still burning. The marshal, the surveyor, and the syndicate's hired muscle would soon arrive. They would see not just one man and an old lamp, but a dozen citizens, silently upholding a verbal agreement, a promise forged on the unforgiving anvil of the West. The battle for the land was still to be fought. But the battle for the valley's soul had just been won by a tiny flame that refused to be put out. The shadow of the Iron Horse, the promise Thomas Kincaid had made, the stubborn refusal marked by the lone, flickering lantern, held. The marshal had arrived, not with the syndicate's hired guns, but with an exasperated, tired deputy. The sight of 12 citizens surrounding the post, witnessing the perpetually burning lantern, had been enough. The law, as Hemlock had feared, favored the appearance of continuous operation. The marshal, seeing no immediate violence and no easy legal resolution, had declared the Kyle claim dispute a matter for the territorial courts, effectively granting the Kincaids and Cedar Valley a temporary injunction. The lantern that kept burning had bought them time, a valuable commodity in the fast-paced, ruthless expansion of the American West. But time was also what Silas Vance, the railway magnate behind the Blackwood Syndicate, dealt in. He did not fight for land claim. He fought for progress, and his ultimate weapon was not a surveyor's chain, but the Iron Horse. It was a Monday morning, scarcely a week after the standoff, when the first crew arrived. Not the lawyers or the roughneck enforcers, but the graders. They came with shovels, picks, and a mechanical steam shovel, a magnificent, terrifying beast of iron and hydraulics that chewed through the earth with contemptuous ease. They did not come to the Kale property. They came straight through the center of Cedar Valley, tracing a line staked out 6 months prior, parallel to the main wagon road. This was the true shadow of the Iron Horse, not the physical locomotive, but the inevitability of its path. The grinding gears of inevitability, the foreman, a broad man with a voice like gravel, set up camp a quarter-mile from the Kincaid sod house. He didn't ask permission. He stated fact. "Railroad's coming through, Kincaid," the foreman announced to Thomas, who stood silently watching the steam shovel tear through a century-old thicket of wild rose bushes. "Blackwood owns the right-of-way granted by federal charter. We start laying ballast tomorrow." The noise was instantaneous and profound. The West, which had always been defined by the sounds of nature, the wind, the coyote's howl, the distant thunder, was now dominated by the clank, hiss, and groan of industry. Sleep became restless. Conversation required shouting. The very rhythm of life in Cedar Valley was violently reset to the cadence of the engine. Eliza watched the process with a complex mixture of fear and fascination. The railroad was a terrifying monster, but it was also a miracle of efficiency. It could move 500 times the cargo of their best mule team. It meant the potential for easier access to larger markets for their crops and cattle. And it meant connecting Cedar Valley to the wider world, a world Eliza secretly longed to map and understand. "It changes everything, Papa," Eliza said to Thomas that evening, the smell of coal smoke heavy in the air. Thomas was patching a large hole in the fence that the grader's heavy equipment had accidentally ripped. "Change is rarely kind, El. It's a tool for the powerful. It connects the world so Vance can bleed it dry faster." The first casualty of this progress was not land, but water. The graders, in need of continuous steam power, began tapping into the deepest groundwater nearest their line. Within days, 2 of the Kincaid's shallowest wells ran dry. Their neighbor, the miller, had to begin rationing water for his grinding wheel. "They're stealing the breath from the valley," Sarah Kincaid lamented, watching their precious, hard-won well water trickle into a bucket. Sarah's disdain for the West now focused entirely on the Iron Horse, a symbol of the uncivilized disruption that had invaded their exile. The clash of economies, rye versus steel, the Kincaid family's immediate economic struggle centered on the upcoming rye harvest. Rye was Thomas's specialty, a sturdy, drought-resistant grain that yielded reliable income. However, the dust and fine ash churned up by the grading machines now settled like a choking blanket on the rye stalks. "The crop is ruined for market quality," Caleb declared, walking through the fields with a handful of dusty gray grain. "It's contaminated with coal soot and rock dust. We can sell it as feed, maybe, but we'll get half the price." This was Silas Vance's genius, control by attrition. He didn't need to physically seize the land if he could render the harvest economically worthless. The smaller farmers, reliant on that single annual crop, would be forced to sell their deeds to the syndicate for pennies, just to pay off their bank loans. Eliza, seeing the despair in her father's eyes, rallied her unique strength, arithmetic and logic. She knew that beating Vance required more than just stubbornness. It required modern economics. She pulled out her ledger, now covered in coal dust, and began charting the syndicate's costs against the Kincaid's potential income. Syndicate cost, laying track, high initial cost, minimal long-term maintenance. Kincaid income, rye harvest, chocolate high annual risk, low margin. "We can't fight the railroad with rye." "Papa," Eliza said, tapping her pencil against the paper, "we have to fight it with a different kind of crop. Something that needs the railroad to survive." "And what is that, El?" Thomas asked tiredly. "Corn, wheat? They suffer the dust even worse." "Cattle," Caleb supplied, his ranching experience coming to the forefront. "The cattle are too far away for the dust to matter, and they can be driven to the new railhead. More importantly, the only profitable way to move a large herd to the eastern markets is by rail. Vance needs our cattle on his trains almost as much as we need his trains to sell them." This was the economic pivot. The Kincaids had a small, modest herd, enough for subsistence but not for major market sales. They needed a larger herd, and they needed the cooperation of the other valley farmers. Eliza grabbed her shawl. "The railhead is being built 5 miles west of the valley. If we can pool the valley's herds, we can present the syndicate with a large, immediate, and necessary source of income for their new line. They can't afford to sabotage a valuable customer." The assembly of the new Promise the General Store became the meeting point. The air inside was thick with the scent of coffee, kerosene, and fear. The local farmers, the Millers, the Andersons, and the hardy Swedish families listened grimly to Eliza's proposal. "If we form a cooperative, the Cedar Valley Stock Pool," Eliza explained, standing on a crate, her voice clear despite her nervousness. "We can market 200 head of cattle collectively. We demand a guaranteed fair tariff from Vance, signed and notarized, in exchange for exclusive use of his railhead for the first year." The blacksmith, a gruff man named Jonas, hammered his fist on the counter. "Vance doesn't make fair tariffs, girl. He sets them. He'll starve us out on the cost alone." "He might," Eliza agreed, looking directly at Jonas. "But his line is new. It needs revenue to impress the Eastern investors. 200 head of cattle, right now, is revenue. He needs us to make his line look viable. If he charges us too much, The risk is that we drive the cattle to the next railhead 20 miles south. That's a gamble he can't afford right now. The conversation raged for an hour. There was deep-seated mistrust of anything involving rail lines and corporations, but the dust on their rye, the dryness of their wells, and the incessant grinding noise of the steam shovel outside convinced them. The Iron Horse had brought with it a necessary new brutality, economic unity. Jonas, the blacksmith, finally stood up. "I'll put in my 20 steers. But if that little lantern of yours goes out, Eliza, the deal is off. We trust the light more than your paperwork." The betrayal of the track. The next phase of the railroad construction brought a far more dangerous shadow. The foreman, following Vance's clear, unwritten orders, began using their new right-of-way, the federally granted strip of land 100 feet wide, as a pretext to interfere with the Kincaids' lives. They drove their steam shovel right up to the Kincaid property line, their heavy machinery vibrating the foundations of the sod house. They set up huge, smoky bonfires for heating the steel rails, sending billows of acrid smoke directly over the vegetable garden. Worst of all, they began using the land near the river to dump excavated rock and waste, threatening to dam a crucial tributary. They aren't just building a railroad. Papa, Eliza noticed, her anger cold and sharp. They are building a barrier to drive us out. They want the land cheap. Caleb, meanwhile, was doing his part, riding out every day to consolidate the pooled herd. He was negotiating with the skeptical ranchers, promising them a future where the profits stayed in the valley. One afternoon, Caleb returned early. He was furious, his face drawn. "The syndicate!" Caleb spat, dismounting Justice. "They filed a secondary claim against the Millers' land. They used the right-of-way charter, saying the Millers' mill stream is a hazardous encroachment on their operational space. They want the mill property for a water tower. The Millers' mill was the single most vital piece of infrastructure in the valley. If it went, the community was finished. The promise of the stock pool, the guaranteed tariff, it all became worthless." Thomas clenched his fists. "They are using the very laws designed to benefit the nation to destroy a small community. We have to fight it in the territorial court." "Papa, it'll cost money we don't have," Eliza said, running her hands through her hair in desperation. Suddenly, Caleb walked over to the old deed box. He pulled out his own meager savings, a small roll of bills earned from 2 years of grueling ranch work. "We don't use that," Caleb said, his voice hard. "We use Vance's own weapon against him." He handed Eliza a thin, yellowed sheet of paper. It was a map of the original rail line survey done 20 years prior, before Vance had bought the controlling interest. "Where did you get this?" Eliza breathed, recognizing the territorial office's official seal. "I didn't just ride cattle up north, El. I worked the land titles. Vance got his federal charter for the rail line based on this original survey. But when he actually built the line, he shifted it 100 feet west to avoid a troublesome rock formation. Look here." Caleb pointed a calloused finger at the map. "The line they are building is not the line they were chartered for. Their current right-of-way is not a federally protected space. It is just unauthorized trespass on private land." Eliza's mind raced, fueled by the brilliant simplicity of the realization. Vance had cut a corner to save a few $1,000s on blasting rock, and in doing so, had exposed a fundamental legal flaw in his entire operation. "The whole Cedar Valley section," Eliza whispered, a fierce, cold excitement rushing through her. "The track itself is illegal trespass on dozens of homesteads. The Millers, the Andersons, the Kincaids, all of us." Thomas stood watching his children. The old idealist watched his children become the ruthless legal fighters the West required. "The lantern bought us time," Thomas said, picking up the small lamp. He held it up, the light catching the dust motes dancing in the air. "Now that time must be spent putting out the fire, El. Not the fire in the stove, but the fire of Vance's ambition." Eliza looked at her brother and father. The shadow of the Iron Horse had nearly crushed them, but in its darkness they had found their own light. She had the numbers, Caleb had the evidence, and Thomas had the unwavering spirit of the community. They had not only an economic plan, the stock pool, but a legal nuclear option, the faulty charter. The wind outside howled. carrying the dissonant clang of the construction workers hammering steel. The sound was no longer just noise. It was the rhythmic beating of a weapon they were about to turn against its owner. "We ride to the territorial office tomorrow," Eliza declared, folding the precious map and tucking it securely into the deed box. Not just to file a counterclaim for the miller's land, but to file an injunction against the entire line for unauthorized trespass. "We're not fighting for a corner of land anymore, Papa. We're fighting for the right to control our own progress." The battle for the soul of Cedar Valley was about to move from the dusty prairie to the sterile halls of justice. Armed with a hidden map, a stubborn flame, and the unwavering promise carried on the prairie wind, the Iron Horse had cast its shadow, but the light of the Kincaids was about to expose the lie at its foundation. The bartered land and the broken trust. The journey to the territorial office in the burgeoning town of Red Rock was a grim necessity, an unwelcome departure from the dirt and rhythm of Cedar Valley. Thomas Kincaid drove the wagon, the precious yellowed map of the original rail charter tucked inside the lantern, which he carried not for light, but as a symbolic piece of evidence. Eliza rode beside him, her mind a furious tally sheet of legal statutes and economic projections. Caleb rode justice ahead, a scout guarding their secret. Red Rock was a shock, a bustling, muddy chaos fueled by the very railroad money that threatened their existence. The air was thick with the stench of industry, and the sound of hammering was ceaseless. It was the finished West that Thomas had always feared. Loud, greedy, and built entirely on the backs of the small farmers. Their first stop was the territorial office, a cramped, dusty room overseen by a portly clerk named Mr. Davies, whose loyalty, they knew, was bought and paid for by the Blackwood Syndicate. "We are here to file an injunction," Eliza stated, placing the deed box on the counter with a firm hand. An injunction against the Blackwood Syndicate's operation in Cedar Valley, citing unauthorized trespass on private and claimed properties, based on a deviation from their original federal charter. Davies peered over his spectacles, instantly recognizing the Kincaids as trouble. "That is a very serious and very expensive accusation, Miss Kincaid. Do you have proof?" Thomas silently lifted the lantern and placed it next to the deed box. "The proof is in this lamp, Mr. Davies, and on the original 1878 survey map, which we have here." As Thomas unrolled the fragile, yellowed document, Davies' eyes widened slightly, a momentary flicker of panic crossing his face before being quickly masked. He knew the cost of this revelation. The Kincaids had found the Achilles heel of Vance's entire western expansion, a lazy corner cut years ago that invalidated miles of track. "This will need review by the territorial judge." "Of course," Davies managed, his voice suddenly less arrogant. "This office will hold the documents and schedule a hearing. Expect a decision, perhaps in a month." "No," Eliza cut in sharply. "The syndicate's operations are currently damaging property. We demand an immediate temporary restraining order. The law provides for expedited review when irreparable harm is occurring. Look at the damage to the miller's stream for proof." Eliza's knowledge of the statutes, painstakingly studied over sleepless nights, tripped up the corrupt clerk. Davies was forced to accept the filing and stamp the paperwork with an expedited date. 1 week. The Bartering Begins news of the Kincaids' audacious filing reached the syndicate's local representative, Mr. Winston, within hours. Winston was Vance's shadow in the West, slick, educated, and utterly ruthless. He knew the faulty charter map was a crisis. If the entire section of rail had to be rerouted, the cost would be staggering, and the delays would infuriate the Eastern investors. Winston tracked the Kincaids down at the general store, where they were stocking up on supplies. "Kincaid," Winston said, his voice smooth and oily, "let's dispense with the legal theater. You have a very nice map, a very troublesome map, but maps like men can be misplaced." "That map is officially filed, Winston," Caleb said, stepping forward, his presence immediately dominating the small space. "Indeed. But the territorial judge is a sensible man. He knows the economy of the entire territory rests on the timely completion of the rail. Do you really believe he will halt progress for a handful of homesteaders?" Winston smiled. a cold, practiced gesture. "Let's talk barter." Winston laid out the offer: monetary compensation. A handsome sum, enough to pay off the Kincaid mortgage and all their debts. Guaranteed tariff. The entire Cedar Valley stock pool would receive the lowest possible freight rates for 10 years. Guaranteed in writing. The Kyle land. The syndicate would drop its claim on the Kale River parcel entirely, allowing the Kincaids to assume the deed. It was an offer designed to appeal to every facet of the Kincaids' needs: security for Thomas, profit for Caleb, and the protection of the community's water supply. It was the ultimate temptation of the bartered land. Thomas looked at the offer, his eyes drawn to the phrase, "the Kyle land." Kyle's memory and the promise made to him was the foundation of this fight. You drop the claim on the Kale land, and you guarantee the tariff, Thomas mused, looking past Winston. "What is the price, Winston?" "The price," Winston stated, leaning in, "is the map. You withdraw the injunction and file an affidavit stating the map in the territorial office is a forgery or a mistake. We proceed with the existing rail line. The judge gets an easy day, you get your valley saved, and Vance gets his railroad." Eliza felt a sickening twist in her stomach. It was the ultimate broken trust, to save their community by lying, by invalidating the very evidence of their righteous cause. "You want us to sacrifice the truth for security," Eliza stated, her voice trembling slightly with suppressed rage. "I want you to be practical." "Miss Kincaid," Winston corrected gently. "Truth is expensive in the West. Practicality is profitable." The betrayal of the light Thomas asked for a night to consider. The Kincaids returned to Cedar Valley, the silence of the prairie now deafening after the clamor of Red Rock. That evening, the family gathered around the wooden table. The lantern, still carrying its crucial document, sat between them, its small flame casting long, nervous shadows. "It's a good offer, Papa," Caleb admitted, tracing the pattern of the wood grain. "It protects Kale's land, it saves the valley's water, and it gives us the freight rates we need for the stock pool to succeed. It's a bitter pill, but it saves the whole valley from a fight we might lose anyway." Sarah Kincaid, their mother, finally spoke, her voice thick with emotion. "Take the deal, Thomas. Take the money. The West has already taken too much from us. Our ease, our comforts, our son William, who died years ago on the trail. We deserve a little peace, a little security. That lantern has burned long enough." Thomas, the idealist, looked at the lantern, then at the tear tracks on his wife's face. He was torn between his integrity and his duty to his family. The law and the syndicate had successfully weaponized his love for his community. "If we take the deal," Thomas said, his voice barely a whisper, "if we claim the map is a lie, then every single farmer who rallied with us, the Millers, Jonas, the Andersons, will know that their courage was used as leverage for our private gain. We will have bartered their trust for our security. We become no better than Vance. We become survivors, Thomas," Sarah cried. Eliza listened, her mind moving with cold clarity. "It's more than just trust, Mama. If we invalidate the map, we give Vance a free pass to do this again, further down the line. He'll find another water source, another mill to steal. We're not saving the valley. We're just buying a delay for ourselves." The promise carried on the prairie wind was unity. The money offered by Winston was the price of shattering that unity. Thomas stood up and walked out into the dark night. He walked toward the Kyle homestead, toward the post where the other identical lantern still burned, a sentinel of integrity. He found Caleb there, sitting sentinel on justice. "Did you come to turn the other light out, Caleb?" Thomas asked. "I came to guard it, Papa," Caleb replied. "I rode to the Millers today. They are preparing their defense based on the map. They trust us. And if we take the money?" Caleb was silent for a long moment, watching the small, steadfast flame. "Then we live like kings in a valley that hates us. And the finished West that Vance builds will have its roots not just in greed, but in the memory of our betrayal." Thomas placed his hand on Caleb's shoulder. The decision was made. The trust of their neighbors was the currency they valued higher than gold or safety. The finality of refusal the next morning. The Kincaids returned to Red Rock, not to file the affidavit of forgery, but to attend the hearing. Winston was waiting, smug and confident. "A wise decision, Kincaid. The papers are ready. Just sign here, confirm the map is a mistake, and you walk away wealthy and safe." Thomas shook his head slowly. "We will not sign the affidavit, Winston." Winston's practiced smile vanished. "You fool. You will lose everything. Your land, your tariffs, your standing. The judge will side with the railroad, and you will receive nothing but a bill for the court costs." "Perhaps," Thomas agreed, his voice calm. "But we will keep our word. We keep the map, and we keep the trust of Cedar Valley." The hearing was brief and brutal. The territorial judge, a man who saw his duty as protecting commerce over small claims, listened impatiently as Eliza presented the original charter map and her meticulously reasoned argument regarding the illegal deviation. Winston's lawyer countered with the brute force of Vance's power. The economic necessity of the rail, the technicality of the Kincaids' delayed filing, and a veiled threat that halting the line would result in a massive economic downturn for the entire territory. The judge banged his gavel with finality. In the matter of the Kincaid injunction against the Blackwood Syndicate, the court finds for the defendant. "The injunction is hereby denied." The courtroom erupted in applause from the syndicate's entourage. Thomas, Eliza, and Caleb stood frozen. They had played their strongest card, the undeniable truth of the map, and they had lost. The law, like the land, had been bartered. The new promise, as they walked out into the dusty street. Defeated and utterly ruined, the court costs alone would bankrupt them. A young man rushed up to Eliza. He was Cale's son, Elias Cale, Jr., whom Caleb had tracked down through old ranching connections. "I got your telegram." "Miss Kincaid," Elias said, his voice urgent. "You said my father's claim was under threat." "Where is it?" Eliza pointed east. "On the river. It's lost, Elias. We used the claim as leverage against the railroad, but the judge sided with Vance." "Lost?" Elias frowned. "No, it isn't. I have the real deed." My father never trusted the territorial office. He filed his final claim not in Red Rock, but in the nearest federal land office in the capital 2 years ago, just before he fell ill. He knew a local court would never stand up to Vance. Elias pulled a clean, crisp, federally registered deed from his satchel. It was dated and stamped. The Cale property was legally and irrevocably his. Eliza looked at the deed, then back at her father. They had stood by the fragile truth, and in return, the truth had found its own way to survive. The local law had been bartered and broken, but the federal law, the higher authority, had quietly held the line. "Winston," Thomas called out, his voice strong and clear. Winston turned, smiling condescendingly. "Enjoy your poverty, Kincaid." Thomas held up the federally stamped deed. "The Cale land is not yours, Winston. It is Elias Kyle's, legally filed and secured 2 years ago. The water rights are protected. Your primary reason for fighting us, the river access, is now moot." Winston's face went white. The syndicate had focused all its energy on fighting a local claim, never bothering to check the federal registry. They had traded their integrity for a map, while the truly vital piece of the valley, the Cale property, had been secured by a quiet, honest man's foresight. Eliza watched the train steam in, its black smoke a shadow against the clear sky. They had lost the battle for the rail line's legality, but they had won the war for the valley's survival. The bartered land remained, but the broken trust of the law had been bypassed by the unwavering integrity of one man's promise. They had their truth, they had their water, and they had their unity. The next stage of the fight was now clear, the economic one. A winter's tale of want and waiting. The winter of 1898-1899 descended upon Cedar Valley not with a gentle dusting of snow, but with a brutal, frozen fist. It arrived early, locking the prairie into a crystalline, unforgiving stillness that swallowed the sounds of the distant railway construction and silenced the very breath of the land. After the legal skirmish in Red Rock, a temporary, uneasy peace had settled. Silas Vance, humiliated by the loss of the Cale River land to Elias Cale Jr.'s prior federal filing, had temporarily halted the most aggressive local land grabs. However, his iron horse, the railroad, was nearing completion, and his strategy had shifted from land acquisition to economic suffocation. The Kincaids had won a legal battle, but they were about to face a far more ancient and formidable enemy: the cold, the price of a small victory. The court costs from the injunction, though not officially charged to the Kincaids, as Elias Cale Jr., had paid them using a small inherited sum, had drained the family's meager savings. The rye harvest, already ruined by the coal dust, yielded barely enough income to buy flour and sugar for the winter store. The lantern, the symbol of their hard-won integrity, now hung inside the sod house, too precious, too vital to leave exposed to the harsh elements. Its faint glow provided more psychological warmth than actual heat. Thomas would still meticulously trim the wick, but the oil was now rationed, burning only during the darkest hours before dawn and after supper. "Want and waiting," Sarah Kincaid muttered one afternoon, watching the relentless snowflakes fall outside the window. "That's all the West has ever given us." She spent her days mending, darning, and desperately conserving the thin blankets, her mind miles away in the comforting warmth of an imagined past. Eliza, however, saw the winter not as a curse, but as a strategic pause. She used the forced inactivity to focus on the Cedar Valley stock pool, the cooperative plan she and Caleb had devised. Their aim was to pool the small herds of the valley's farmers, presenting Vance with a large enough consignment of cattle to force him into signing a fair, long-term tariff agreement for the new rail line. "This winter is our forge, Caleb," Eliza told her brother, who often struggled with the monotony of waiting. "We can't work the soil, but we can work the trust among the farmers. We need to secure every signature, every head of cattle, before spring planting distracts them." Caleb, the man of action, found the confinement difficult. He spent his time repairing tools, cleaning the stable, and riding out only when absolutely necessary to check the pooled herds, which were consolidated on Elias Cale Jr.'s protected, well-watered land. The erosion of trust, the extreme cold, however, made the cooperative difficult to maintain. The want of the winter was slowly eroding the trust they had so recently forged. The Andersons, whose small herd had been hit by a sudden outbreak of a mysterious winter sickness, began to panic. They needed cash immediately to buy feed and medicine, and they saw only one option: selling their remaining healthy cattle, the very cattle pledged to the stock pool, to a traveling meat broker at a pittance. "We can't afford to wait for spring, Eliza," Mrs. Anderson tearfully explained when Eliza rode out to their claim. "The railroad doesn't care if my children starve, and neither will Vance's tariff." This was the syndicate's silent victory. By simply existing, by withholding a fair tariff, Vance forced the desperate farmers to break their own economic agreements, dismantling the collective resistance from within. Eliza, seeing the despair, knew she couldn't simply appeal to their loyalty. She needed to provide immediate capital. "We have to show them that the pool is not just a spring contract, but a winter shield," Eliza told Thomas and Caleb that night. "They need a loan, small, immediate, and without the exorbitant interest of the moneylenders." "We have no capital, Elle," Thomas reminded her gently. "We are living on dried beans and hope." Caleb, ever the pragmatic cowboy, pointed to the brass lantern on the table. "Not quite. Elias Cale Jr. gave me a small bag of silver before we left Red Rock. Payment for guarding his land. It's enough for the Andersons' feed, but it's tied up in the cost of that damn court case. We need collateral." Eliza looked at her mother, who was sitting silently by the stove, clutching her worn locket. Sarah finally looked up. "My locket, Eliza," Sarah whispered, taking the gold chain from around her neck. "It was my grandmother's, my only connection to the life I left behind. Take it. Use it to secure a loan from the miller. He's fair, and he still believes in the promise. The sacrifice was enormous. It wasn't just a piece of jewelry, it was Sarah's last material link to her past, a tangible piece of the finished world she yearned for. This was the depth of the Kincaids' commitment to the valley's future. The miller's ledger, Eliza, rode to the miller's homestead the next day. The miller, a staunchly moral man, agreed to the loan, accepting Sarah's locket not for its gold value, but as a testament to the Kincaids' faith. "You've bought the Anderson's feed for a month, Eliza," the miller said, handing her the small bag of cash. "But the sickness is spreading. The blacksmith Jonas has 2 calves down. If the pool starts to crumble now, Vance wins without firing a shot." Eliza realized the problem wasn't merely financial, it was biological and logistical. They needed modern knowledge to fight the unknown sickness, and they needed a system to prevent its spread. That night, utilizing the precious rationed light of the lantern, Eliza pored over the old dusty farm almanacs Thomas had brought west. She didn't know medicine, but she understood systems. She needed to turn the chaotic group of desperate homesteads into an organized information-sharing collective. "We need a winter watch," she declared to Caleb. "A scheduled ride to check every single pooled herd, not just for feed levels, but for signs of illness. We need to quarantine any affected animals immediately." Caleb's eyes, usually dull from the waiting, lit up with purpose. This was a challenge he could meet with his saddle and his skill. The next morning, despite the deep snow, Caleb and the miller's son, a quiet boy named Sven, rode out. They began a methodical circuit, a patrol against want and disease. The schoolhouse. And the spreading light Eliza's fight shifted to knowledge. She knew the sickness was unknown, but she suspected the cause was poor sanitation or lack of minerals, problems that modern farming techniques in the East had solved. She convinced the miller to allow a meeting at the small, drafty, one-room schoolhouse. A few farmers gathered, skeptical and frozen. "We have been fighting Vance, the law, and the dust," Eliza began, her breath clouding the cold air. "But we are losing to something smaller, ignorance. We must share what little knowledge we have. We must use this winter to learn the new ways of farming and ranching, so that when spring comes, the stock pool is not just financially strong, but biologically secure." She presented a rough diagram on the schoolhouse chalkboard, a simple quarantine system Caleb had devised, isolating the sick animals. She used her knowledge of almanacs and Caleb's experience to identify the potential culprits: poor water drainage and mineral deficiencies in the feed. The blacksmith, Jonas, initially resistant, slowly warmed to the idea. "The new knowledge, is that the new promise, Eliza?" "The new promise," Eliza affirmed, tapping the chalkboard, "is that we refuse to be defeated by what we don't know. We will use this time of waiting to become smarter, stronger, and more organized than Vance could ever imagine." The schoolhouse became a makeshift winter university. Farmers pooled their old magazines, sharing articles on herd management, scientific agriculture, and simple veterinary remedies. The communal focus shifted from complaining to learning. The Winter Watch, led by Caleb, became the Valley's new essential service, protecting their shared assets. The unextinguishable flame of unity, by the time the brutal cold began to recede. In early February, the Cedar Valley stock pool was not just intact, it was stronger. Herd health. Caleb's strict quarantine measures had contained the sickness, saving the main herd. Community unity. The shared effort and Eliza's financial maneuvering, securing the loan with Sarah's locket, which the Andersons vowed to help repay, had deepened the trust. Economic readiness. The farmers were now organized, knowledgeable, and prepared to present a unified, healthy herd to the market. Eliza rode out to the Kale homestead. The snow was beginning to melt, revealing the muddy, tenacious soil beneath. The lantern, still at the center of the land, was burning brightly. Elias Kyle Jr. had maintained the flame, sheltering it from the worst of the blizzards. It never went out, Elias said, wiping snow from his face. Even when the wind tried its best. It's a symbol of Thomas's promise, Eliza replied. No, Miss Kincaid, Elias corrected, pointing to the tracks left by Caleb and Sven's frequent patrols. It's a symbol of the entire valley's promise. Your family had every reason to keep their own resources and leave the Andersons to starve. But you risked your own security for the collective. That's what kept the light burning. As the first tentative warmth of spring touched the valley, the sound of the iron horse returned, the harsh, grating screech of steel on steel as the last sections of rail were laid. The railroad was finished. Silas Vance was ready to open his line and impose his tariffs. But Cedar Valley was also ready. They had survived the winter, their herds were healthy, and their contract was signed. The want of the winter had been a test, and the waiting had been their training. They had exchanged gold for trust and fear for knowledge. The time for negotiation was over. The time for the stock pool to demand its rightful place on the iron horse had arrived. The scholar and the soil, the spring thaw arrived not as a sudden torrent, but as a gradual, muddy symphony. The snow receded, revealing the soil, dark, rich in some places, pale and exhausted in others. But most importantly, unfrozen. The end of the harsh winter of want and waiting brought with it a surge of renewed energy, a desperate rush to plant the seeds that would secure the next year's survival. Cedar Valley was ready. The collective will, honed by Eliza's financial and logistical maneuvers, was sharp. The stock pool was strong, its herds healthy, and the farmers prepared to demand their guaranteed tariff from Silas Vance's newly completed rail line. But the spring also brought a different kind of thaw. The return of the new generation, those few children of the valley who had been sent east for formal education, escaping the very hardships the community now faced. They returned carrying not shovels but books, not calluses, but theories. The return of the prodigal son, the man who stepped off the first eastbound passenger train to ever rumble through Cedar Valley, stopping at the syndicate's newly constructed, ugly wooden platform, was Samuel Kincaid, 24, Thomas and Sarah's youngest son. He had spent 4 years in Massachusetts studying at the agricultural college, a world away from the dusty realities of the prairie. Samuel was crisp, clean, and carrying a new leather satchel filled with diagrams and scientific papers. His spectacles sat perfectly on his nose, and his hands were smooth, the hands of a scholar, not a farmer. He looked at the vast, desolate land of Cedar Valley, not with the weary acceptance of his parents, but with the analytical focus of a scientist. Eliza, Thomas, and Sarah met him at the platform. The family reunion was immediately strained. "Samuel! You look so east," Sarah exclaimed, hugging him tightly, simultaneously proud and possessive. "It is good to be home, Mama," Samuel said, but his eyes were already scanning the horizon, noting the poor soil drainage and the exposed, wind-whipped fields. Thomas, observing the new rail line, the iron horse, with a grim face, focused on the immediate problem. "Welcome back, son. We need your strong back in the north field. The soil is too clay-heavy. We need to turn it deep and quickly." Samuel did not immediately put his bag down. He adjusted his spectacles. "Father, with respect, the soil in that north field shouldn't be turned deeply at all. That will only expose the mineral-poor subsoil to the wind and accelerate nutrient leaching. We need a shallow, chisel plow technique and an immediate application of a nitrogen-fixing crop rotation, likely clover before the rye." A profound silence fell over the platform. The rough-hewn farmers watching the scene exchanged skeptical glances. To the settlers of Cedar Valley, deep plowing was an article of faith, a relentless effort to break the back of the land. "I have worked this land for 10 years with my back and my blood." "Samuel," Thomas said, his voice tightening with paternal authority, "I know what it needs. It needs effort." "It needs science, Father," Samuel countered, his youthful confidence hardening his voice. "The effort you expend is wasted if the method is unsound. We need to adapt to this climate, not fight it with brute force." The clash of paradigms, the conflict between the scholar and the soil, became the defining tension of the Kincaid household and, soon, the entire valley. Samuel saw the valley's problems not as divine punishment or bad luck, but as correctable variables. Problem: exhausted soil and poor rye yield. Samuel's solution: systematic crop rotation, cover crops, and soil testing. Problem: lack of local feed for the cattle in winter. Samuel's solution: constructing a silo for fermented fodder, silage, a preservation method unheard of in the valley. Problem: high reliance on the unreliable river water. Samuel's solution: calculating water flow and designing a simple, gravity-fed irrigation system to draw water efficiently from Elias Cale's protected land. Thomas. Caleb and the elder farmers saw Samuel's ideas as theoretical, impractical, and frankly, disrespectful of the traditions that had kept them alive. Your science cannot measure the wind. Boy, Jonas the blacksmith scoffed during a community meeting, nor can it stop the drought. We do what our fathers did: pray for rain and plow deep. Eliza, caught between the two, played the crucial role of translator. She was the only one who understood both her father's traditional ethics, integrity and hard work, and Samuel's scientific logic. She had already employed her own version of science during the winter crisis, organizing the quarantine based on logic rather than folklore. His methods are expensive, Papa, but they reduce risk, Eliza explained patiently to Thomas. The stock pool needs guaranteed yield to negotiate with Vance. Science is just organized risk management. The betrayal of the tradition. The biggest challenge came from the irrigation system. Samuel calculated that a simple series of trenches and a small wooden diversion dam on the Cale property could draw enough water to sustain the crops through the crucial summer months. Guaranteeing the feed required for the stock pool, Elias Cale, Jr., supportive of any move that secured the valley, readily gave permission. However, the elder farmers, led by an old settler named Mr. Peterson, were vehemently opposed. Peterson relied entirely on the sporadic flood irrigation of the river when the spring rains were heaviest. That river water belongs to God and flows to everyone, Peterson shouted at a meeting. That system is nothing but a theft of what little flow we have. You build that dam, Samuel, and you break the tradition of sharing the common water. The community was fiercely divided. The older generation saw the dam as a symbol of selfish modernization, taking the communal resource and concentrating it for the benefit of the organized stock pool, thereby abandoning the small independent farmers. The promise of unity forged in the winter threatened to break apart in the spring. Thomas, deeply concerned by the division, faced a crisis of conscience. He had built his life on the principle of communal solidarity. We cannot build prosperity on the resentment of our neighbors, Samuel. It is a broken trust. Samuel was exasperated. They are resisting their own salvation, Father. The natural flow is wasteful. My system uses the water efficiently, leaving more in the river overall than Peterson's uncontrolled flood irrigation. This isn't theft, it's stewardship. The crisis of the seed, the argument was decided not by reason, but by catastrophe. Despite Samuel's warnings, Thomas and several of the traditional farmers decided to follow the old way, plowing their rye fields deep and planting the traditional low-yield seed. Samuel, with Eliza's quiet support and Caleb's muscle, established a test plot using his clover rotation and the new, high-yield turkey red wheat, a grain renowned for its hardiness but new to the valley. Just 2 weeks after planting, a sudden fierce late-spring dust storm roared down the valley. It was a terrifying event, stripping the unprotected topsoil from the land. When the dust settled, the devastation was clear. Thomas's deeply plowed fields were ravaged. The newly exposed mineral-poor subsoil was now bare, the low-lying rye seeds ripped out by the roots. The first ash had given way to the dust of disaster. However, the test plot managed by Samuel and Caleb survived. The clover acted as a cover crop, binding the soil with its deeper roots and shielding the young turkey red wheat shoots from the wind. Thomas stood in his ruined field, a lifetime of tradition turning to dust in his hands. He walked to the edge of the surviving plot, watching his son, Samuel, calmly inspecting the hardy young wheat. "You saved your patch," Thomas said, his voice hoarse with defeat. Science respects the conditions of the land, Father. It doesn't fight them, Samuel replied quietly. The lit lantern and the new lease. The failure of the traditional methods was a sharp, painful lesson for the entire valley. The drought predictions for the summer were severe, and without a viable crop, the entire stock pool and the community would face ruin, regardless of the tariff they won from Vance. That evening, Thomas did something he hadn't done since the depths of winter. He took the lantern, trimmed the wick meticulously, and filled the brass reservoir completely with fresh whale oil. He lit it, carried it outside, and placed it prominently on the porch railing. The flame was strong, casting a wide circle of defiant golden light against the darkening sky. Eliza, Caleb, Samuel, he said, addressing his children as equals for the first time. We will build Samuel's dam, and we will use the turkey red seed. I was wrong to confuse tradition with intelligence. The light that burns here must be a light of learning, not just stubbornness. The next day, the entire community, including the reluctant Mr. Peterson, gathered at the Kale property. Thomas, not Samuel, drove the first stake for the diversion dam. Eliza managed the logistics, ensuring the shared effort was efficient and fair. Caleb and Samuel directed the construction, combining Caleb's practical knowledge of wood and water flow with Samuel's calculated angles and pressures. The dam was built in 3 days, a simple, sturdy structure that began drawing water cleanly and steadily into the newly dug irrigation trenches. The scholar and the soil had finally merged. Samuel's knowledge, combined with the community's organized effort, Eliza's structure, and Caleb's skill, had transformed the land from a victim of the elements into a master of its own limited resources. By the time the Blackwood Syndicate's representatives arrived in late Taputiuha, May to negotiate the annual tariff with the Cedar Valley stock pool, they found a changed valley. They found fields of healthy, deep green turkey red wheat protected by clover. They found a sophisticated irrigation system ensuring a steady supply of feed. They found a community not divided by want, but united by knowledge and purpose. The syndicate had expected to negotiate with desperate, ruined farmers, easily forced into accepting predatory rates. Instead, they faced Eliza Kincaid, the head negotiator for a unified, organized, and scientifically managed cooperative. The Iron Horse was ready to run. Cedar Valley was ready to ride it. And the light of the Kincaid's lantern was no longer just a promise of integrity, but a beacon of intelligent progress. The true spirit that would finally finish the West. The time for waiting was over. The time for the town hall assembly had begun. A quiet fire in the town hall. The air in Cedar Valley was thick not with dust or coal smoke, but with tension. The early summer brought a vibrant, defiant green to the fields, a testament to the success of Samuel Kincaid's scientific farming methods and the new irrigation dam. The turkey red wheat was thriving, and the collective stock pool herd was healthy and growing fat on the irrigated KL land. The community had won the legal battle for the KL land and the knowledge war against the soil. Now the final, crucial confrontation awaited. The economic negotiation for the railroad tariff with the Blackwood Syndicate. The meeting was scheduled for the following day at the town hall, the unpainted, hastily constructed wooden building that served as the valley's civic heart. The atmosphere felt less like a town meeting and more like a besieged fortress. The fire that was about to be lit was not one of rage, but of cold, calculated economic resolve. The negotiating table, Eliza Kincaid, elected as the chief negotiator for the Cedar Valley Stock Pool Cooperative, spent the evening poring over her final calculations. She was armed with Samuel's yield projections, Caleb's detailed herd counts, and her own relentless arithmetic. Their goal was simple: to secure a guaranteed long-term fair tariff, GLFT, from Silas Vance, a fixed, low freight rate for their livestock and crops, valid for at least 5 years. This rate needed to be competitive enough to undercut the cost of driving their herds 20 miles to the next railhead. We can absorb a high rate for a single year. Caleb explained, leaning over her ledger. But if Vance raises it every season, he owns us. The GLFT is the only thing that makes the stock pool viable long-term. Vance's local representative, Mr. Winston, will argue the cost of the new line justifies a high tariff, Eliza muttered, running a tired hand through her hair. He'll offer a token rate for the first consignment, then threaten to hike it up next year. Thomas Kincaid sat by the lantern, which cast a silent, resolute glow on the proceedings. Winston will try to divide you, Eliza. He will offer incentives to the larger pool members, Jonas, the miller, if they break rank. Remember what we lost for the trust of this valley. That trust is our greatest asset. Eliza knew the economic facts were on their side. Vance's newly completed rail line was running well behind its projected revenue goals, and the 200 head of high-quality cattle from the stock pool represented a much-needed, immediate injection of cash flow. The town hall assembly, the town hall was packed. Every member of the stock pool cooperative, 30 families strong, was present. They sat on hard benches, their faces grim, a silent, powerful jury. The lantern, brought by Thomas, was placed on a small side table, a quiet, flickering reminder of their integrity and their shared commitment. Mr. Winston arrived precisely on time, accompanied by 2 syndicate lawyers in starched collars and a pair of heavy-set men who served as private security. Winston wore a confident, almost theatrical air of benevolent superiority. He saw the town hall as a dusty inconvenience. He saw the farmers as simple, easily manipulated rubes. The negotiations began formally. Winston started with a polished speech about progress and shared prosperity. The Blackwood Syndicate has brought the modern age to Cedar Valley, Winston announced, gesturing grandly. This incredible piece of engineering requires substantial investment. Therefore, our standard freight rate for cattle and grain is set at a necessary but fair 2 cents per ton-mile. A low collective groan rippled through the hall. 2 cents per ton-mile was exorbitant. It would consume almost 40% of their projected profit, effectively making the stock pool worthless. It was the expected opening move, the economic suffocation strategy. Eliza rose, her demeanor calm, her voice clear and without inflection. She ignored the dramatic speech and went straight to the numbers. The Cedar Valley stock pool formally rejects the proposed rate of 2 cents per ton-mile, Eliza stated. It is neither fair nor necessary. Based on your official filing documents with the Territorial Office, we calculate that a rate of 1.25 cents per ton-mile is sufficient to cover your operating costs and provide a 15% rate of return on investment, which is the industry standard for new lines. The syndicate lawyers exchanged surprised glances. They had not expected the farmers to cite the syndicate's internal profit projections. Eliza was not negotiating based on need. She was negotiating based on Vance's bottom line. The fire of logic Winston immediately attempted to pivot to personal appeal and intimidation. Miss Kincaid, you are an excellent bookkeeper, but you do not run a rail line, Winston said, his tone turning patronizing. These are complex calculations. We will offer a special introductory rate for the stock pool's first shipment, say 1.5 cents. That is our final offer. Take it, or we will fill our cars with ore from the south, leaving your herds to graze on the prairie while they lose weight. This was the expected threat, the waiting game that broke small producers. Eliza did not flinch. She pulled out a large, hand-drawn map of the Western Territory Getty Images. It was annotated with Caleb's precise measurements. We understand your calculation, Mr. Winston. But you are forgetting the competitive alternative, Eliza said, pointing to a spot far south of Cedar Valley. The next railhead, the Pacific Line, is 22 miles away. We calculate that the cost of driving our 200 head of cattle to the Pacific Line, including grazing, feed, and man-hours, is precisely 1 3/10 cents per ton-mile equivalent. She met Winston's eye. Your offer of 1.5 cents is therefore unacceptable. It is more expensive for us to ship with you than to take the cattle to your competitor. The value of your rail line to us is that it saves us time and effort. If your price does not reflect that value, we will use the Pacific Line. The logic was undeniable. The town hall remained silent, but the farmers were nodding in approval. Eliza had neutralized the syndicate's core threat. Winston, visibly rattled, tried the divide-and-conquer strategy. He knew the Miller and Jonas were the largest producers. Very well, Miss Kincaid. A fascinating lecture. But the syndicate needs assurance. Mr. Miller, Mr. Jonas, step forward. We will offer your personal consignments a rate of 1 4/10 cents if you sign separate contracts today and withdraw your stock from this. Cooperative. This was the moment of the broken trust. The bribe was tempting, a small immediate gain for the leaders at the expense of the collective. The Miller, a man of quiet integrity, stepped forward. He walked past Winston and stood next to Eliza. He looked at the lantern, then addressed Winston. My grain is pledged to the pool, Mr. Winston, the Miller said simply. My sons and I survived the winter because of the pool. We do not barter our word for a fraction of a cent. Jonas, the gruff blacksmith, followed suit. The pool feeds my family. We stand together. We take the same rate or we ride south. The unity, forged in the depths of the frozen winter and secured by Sarah Kincaid's locket and Elias Cale's deed, was unbreakable. Winston's attempt at division failed utterly. The quiet fire cornered by the unflinching unity and Eliza's devastating arithmetic, Winston realized he could not win the negotiation on the spot. He had to save face. This is absurd. You demand the keys to the rail line, Winston shouted, his smooth facade finally cracking. The syndicate will not be dictated to by a collection of dirt farmers. We will not sign a long-term contract. We will offer a single consignment rate of 1 3/10 cents, and that is final. It was a concession, but without the GLFT, the victory was meaningless. Next year, Vance would crush them. Eliza took a deep breath. This was the moment for the quiet fire, the controlled, powerful expression of their complete commitment. The stock pool does not accept a single consignment rate. Mr. Winston, Eliza stated, her voice dropping to a low, intense level that forced everyone in the room to lean forward. We require the guaranteed long-term fair tariff of 1 1/4 cents per ton-mile for 5 years. And we require a signed agreement today. She paused, then delivered the killing blow using a fact Samuel had researched. If you refuse, we will ride south to the Pacific Line. But before we leave, the stock pool will file an official complaint with the Federal Railway Commission. We will cite the findings of the Kincaid map, the one you tried to buy, proving your entire Cedar Valley section is built on a defective federal charter. This is not an injunction to stop the train, Mr. Winston. This is a demand for compensation, specifically an annual rental fee for the unauthorized use of private land. Winston's face was ashen. He had been so focused on suppressing the map's use in court that he had overlooked its use as a leverage tool for federal arbitration. An arbitration hearing would be disastrous. It would publicize the charter defect and expose Vance to lawsuits from dozens of homesteads. And the fee we demand for the trespass, Eliza finished, is precisely the value of the difference between the 1 1/4 cent tariff and the 1 3/10 cent tariff, retroactive for every ton hauled since the line opened. We will use Vance's own legal vulnerability to fund our stock pool. The logic was flawless. The threat was not to stop the train, but to bleed it dry through endless legal fees and retroactive rental charges. The signature of trust. The silence in the town hall was absolute. Winston stared at Eliza, recognizing not a farmer's daughter, but a formidable opponent who had mastered his own game. He looked at his lawyers, who subtly shook their heads. Don't risk the federal hearing. He looked at the sea of grim, unified faces. And he looked at the small, unwavering light of the lantern. You will regret this, Kincaid, Winston hissed. We will regret ruin, Mr. Winston, and nothing else, Eliza calmly replied. Winston pulled out a fountain pen and a pre-drafted contract. He crossed out the high rates and meticulously wrote in the lower figure. The Blackwood Syndicate agrees to the guaranteed long-term fair tariff of 1 1/4 cents per ton-mile for 5 years, Winston declared, his voice tight with defeat. But this contract is with the Cedar Valley Stock Pool Cooperative only. No other terms. Eliza accepted the document. She signed first, her signature bold and clear. Then, one by one, the 30 members of the cooperative came forward and signed, the paper growing heavy with the signatures of the United Farmers, the Miller, Jonas, Elias Kyle, Jr., and every man and woman who had stood together against the shadow of the Iron Horse. As Thomas Kincaid signed the final witness line, he looked at Winston, who was already gathering his papers in a defeated fury. "Mr. Winston," Thomas said quietly, "the greatest power in the West is not the Iron Horse. It is a promise kept." The town hall erupted not with a roar, but with a deep, communal sigh of relief and a rising murmur of satisfied conversation. The fire had been quiet, fueled by numbers and trust, and it had achieved a victory more profound than any battle fought with guns. The lantern that kept burning had won the economic independence of Cedar Valley. The community had asserted its right to prosperity, securing its future with the unshakable foundation of collective resolve. The town hall's meeting was over, but the future of the West had just been secured. The outlaw's hand and the judge's gavel, the victory in the town hall, the signing of the Guaranteed Long-Term Fair Tariff, GLFT, sent a wave of relief and unprecedented confidence through Cedar Valley. The stock pool cooperative was thriving, the turkey red wheat was flourishing under the new irrigation, and the economic future was finally secure. Silas Vance's Blackwood Syndicate, defeated on both the legal and economic fronts, withdrew its immediate presence, licking its wounds. But the vast, untamed West was never ruled solely by contracts and good faith. It was a land where the rule of law was often too slow, too corrupt, or too distant to enforce true justice. The peace that settled over Cedar Valley felt unnaturally fragile, like a thin sheet of ice over a deep, turbulent river. This fragility was soon tested by an old, brutal reality: the syndicate's revenge. The quiet sabotage Vance's defeat in the town hall had cost him millions in potential revenue. Since he could not legally raise the tariff, he resorted to the petty, vicious violence of sabotage. The attacks were subtle at first. The gates of the stock pool's main holding pen on the Kyle land were found mysteriously opened, requiring Caleb and Elias Kyle, Jr., to spend days retrieving stray cattle from the distant alkali flats. Then the newly installed wooden dam on the irrigation system was targeted. Key planks were deliberately pried loose, causing minor flooding and interrupting the crucial water supply to the wheat fields for a day. These were not the actions of simple thieves, but of professional vandals, hired men intended to harass and intimidate the cooperative until the farmers gave up their precious tariff agreement. "This is Vance's way of saying the contract is just paper," Caleb noted grimly, patching the irrigation dam with fresh lumber. "He thinks we'll break before he does." Eliza, seeing the financial threat of these disruptions, tried to appeal to the territorial marshal in Red Rock. Her petition was met with bureaucratic indifference. "This is a private dispute over property damage." "Miss Kincaid," the marshal declared, shuffling papers, "I have no proof of syndicate involvement. File a civil suit. The civil suit would take months, cost thousands, and fail to prevent the next act of sabotage." The law, represented by the judge's gavel, was either unwilling or unable to protect the community. The return of the outlaw's hand one humid summer evening, the sabotage escalated into outright violence. A gang of four-armed men, clearly the syndicate's hired muscle, ambushed the miller's wagon on the road back from the town hall. They didn't steal the money or the flour. They viciously beat the miller and his eldest son, leaving them bruised and terrified, and destroyed their new seed drill, a vital, expensive piece of shared equipment for the cooperative. The attack was a message: cooperate and you will be safe. Resist and you will be broken. The farmers of Cedar Valley were plunged into a state of furious, terrified despair. "We can't fight shadows, Thomas!" Jonas, the blacksmith, raged, his voice thick with fear for his own family. "The law won't protect us, and if we guard our property day and night, our crops will rot in the fields." That night, Thomas and Eliza sat in the quiet sod house. The lantern, burning steadily, was the only light. "The law has failed us, Papa," Eliza admitted, her voice low and defeated. "We secured the right, but we cannot secure the peace." Thomas looked at the light, his face etched with turmoil. The West was built by men who took the law into their own hands when justice was denied. But that road ends in blood, El. It ends in becoming the very brutes we are fighting. Suddenly, Caleb, who had been listening silently by the door, spoke up. "There's one man who can stop this," Caleb said, his eyes hard and distant. "A man who knows how to deal with Vance's hired thugs without killing them and without involving the marshal." "Who?" Thomas demanded. "Jesse Thorne," Caleb replied. "An outlaw. He worked the North Range, running cattle, until Vance's men tried to steal his herd on a bogus claim. Thorne didn't fight them in court. He fought them with fear. Jesse Thorne was a legend, a renowned horseman and tracker who had a strict, if brutal, code of justice. He was known for punishing those who preyed on the weak, but he was also a man outside the law." "Absolutely not," Thomas declared, slamming his fist on the table. "We will not sully our victory by consorting with criminals, Caleb." "He is not a criminal, Papa," Caleb insisted, his gaze unwavering. "He's a man who understands that the only language Vance's thugs respect is that of a greater consequence. I rode with him briefly up north. He saved my life once. He won't kill them, but he will make them understand that touching Cedar Valley means ruin." Eliza understood the desperate logic. They needed an outlaw's hand to enforce the justice that the judge's gavel refused to deliver. They needed a symbol of immediate, decisive retribution that Vance would recognize and fear. The price of protection. The debate raged for hours. Thomas saw it as a moral surrender. Eliza saw it as a necessary, temporary evil to protect the collective. The unity, forged in the depths of the frozen winter and secured by Sarah Kincaid's locket and Elias Cale's deed, was unbreakable. Winston's attempt at division failed utterly. The quiet fire cornered by the unflinching unity and Eliza's devastating arithmetic, Winston realized he could not win the negotiation on the spot. He had to save face. "This is absurd. You demand the keys to the rail line," Winston shouted, his smooth facade finally cracking. "The syndicate will not be dictated to by a collection of dirt farmers. We will not sign a long-term contract. We will offer a single consignment rate of 1 3/10 cents, and that is final." It was a concession, but without the GLFT, the victory was meaningless. Next year, Vance would crush them. Eliza took a deep breath. This was the moment for the quiet fire, the controlled, powerful expression of their complete commitment. "The stock pool does not accept a single consignment rate." "Mr. Winston," Eliza stated, her voice dropping to a low, intense level that forced everyone in the room to lean forward. "We require the guaranteed long-term fair tariff of 1 1/4 cents per ton-mile for 5 years. And we require a signed agreement today." She paused, then delivered the killing blow using a fact Samuel had researched. "If you refuse, we will ride south to the Pacific Line. But before we leave, the stock pool will file an official complaint with the Federal Railway Commission. We will cite the findings of the Kincaid map, the one you tried to buy, proving your entire Cedar Valley section is built on a defective federal charter. This is not an injunction to stop the train, Mr. Winston. This is a demand for compensation, specifically an annual rental fee for the unauthorized use of private land." Winston's face was ashen. He had been so focused on suppressing the map's use in court that he had overlooked its use as a leverage tool for federal arbitration. An arbitration hearing would be disastrous. It would publicize the charter defect and expose Vance to lawsuits from dozens of homesteads. "And the fee we demand for the trespass," Eliza finished, "is precisely the value of the difference between the 1 1/4 cent tariff and the 1 3/10 cent tariff. Retroactive for every ton hauled since the line opened. We will use Vance's own legal vulnerability to fund our stock pool." The logic was flawless. The threat was not to stop the train, but to bleed it dry through endless legal fees and retroactive rental charges. The signature of trust, the silence in the town hall, was absolute. Winston stared at Eliza, recognizing not a farmer's daughter, but a formidable opponent who had mastered his own game. He looked at his lawyers, who subtly shook their heads. "Don't risk the federal hearing." He looked at the sea of grim, unified faces, and he looked at the small, unwavering light of the lantern. "You will regret this." "Kincaid!" Winston hissed. "We will regret ruin, Mr. Winston, and nothing else," Eliza calmly replied. Winston pulled out a fountain pen and a pre-drafted contract. He crossed out the high rates and meticulously wrote in the lower figure. The Blackwood Syndicate agrees to the guaranteed long-term fare tariff of 1 1/4 cents per ton-mile for 5 years, Winston declared, his voice tight with defeat. "But this contract is with the Cedar Valley Stock Pool Cooperative only. No other terms." Eliza accepted the document. She signed first, her signature bold and clear. Then, one by one, the 30 members of the cooperative came forward and signed, the paper growing heavy with the signatures of the United Farmers, the Miller, Jonas, Elias Kyle, Jr., and every man and woman who had stood together against the shadow of the Iron Horse. As Thomas Kincaid signed the final witness line, he looked at Winston, who was already gathering his papers in a defeated fury. "Mr. Winston," Thomas said quietly, "the greatest power in the West is not the Iron Horse. It is a promise kept." "We need protection long enough for the cattle drive and the harvest," Eliza argued. "Once the stock pool delivers its first consignment and secures the money, we can afford proper private security. Security the law allows. Thorn is a bridge, Papa, a means to an end." Eventually, Thomas conceded, his heart heavy with compromise. He made Caleb promise 2 things, no killing and no theft. The price of Thorn's service had to be paid from Caleb's own funds, not the stock pool's collective money, to maintain the integrity of the cooperative. Caleb rode out at dawn, disappearing into the vast, lawless territory where men like Jesse Thorn found refuge. He returned 2 days later, accompanied by a lean, quiet man with intense, pale eyes and a hat pulled low. Jesse Thorn was not the wild, theatrical bandit of the dime novels. He was a man of cold, efficient focus. "Caleb tells me you require a demonstration of deterrence," Thorn said, addressing Thomas, his voice raspy from the trail. "We require peace, Mr. Thorn," Thomas corrected, pointing to the lantern. "We have worked for decency, not violence." Thorn glanced at the lamp, a flicker of something close to amusement in his eyes. "Decency is for the parlor, Kincaid. The prairie understands consequence." Thorn took Caleb's money, a significant sum. "I won't kill them, but I'll send them a message that will cost Vance more than any lawsuit." The outlaw's Justice Thorn didn't patrol the valley. He simply vanished. For 2 days, nothing happened. The farmers were on edge, waiting for the marshal, the thugs, or Thorn himself. Then the message arrived. 3 of Vance's hired men, Buck and Ike, the large men from the original surveyor team, and their leader, were found sitting on the porch of the empty town hall. They were tied to the posts, naked save for their long johns, their hands secured with ropes so skillfully knotted that the townspeople had to use axes to free them. More strikingly, they were all shorn. Their long, thick western hair and beards, symbols of their masculinity and identity, were meticulously shaved down to the scalp, leaving them pale, humiliated, and utterly exposed. Pasted to the town hall door, with a large, vicious hunting knife pinning it, was a single hand-drawn notice. "To the syndicate servants, the cattle of Cedar Valley are under new ownership. The price for touching them is your pride. The next price will be your livelihood." The hand of the West. The outlaw's hand had acted not with bloodshed, but with calculated, brutal humiliation. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. The 3 men, stripped of their dignity, immediately packed their belongings and fled the territory, unable to face the endless ridicule. They would never work for Vance again. The reaction in Cedar Valley was mixed. Relief warred with unease. They were safe, their property was secure, but their peace had been bought with a compromise that left a sour taste. The final gavel Winston, the syndicate's local representative, was furious. The humiliation of his thugs was a direct challenge to Vance's authority. He marched straight to the territorial marshal, demanding immediate action. "This is vigilantism! This is banditry!" Winston roared. "You must arrest the Kincaids! They clearly hired this outlaw!" The marshal, tired of the syndicate's pressure, saw a chance to assert the law on his own terms. He rode to the Kincaid homestead, armed with a warrant for conspiracy to commit extortion and assault. Thomas met the marshal at the door, the lantern burning on the porch. "I did not hire him, Marshal," Thomas said calmly. "My son Caleb secured his protection using his own money earned on private ranches. That is not extortion. And you have no evidence that the Kincaid family conspired to commit assault. The 3 men were found alive, well and free to leave." "Your son associated with a known outlaw," the marshal countered. "And you associate with a known land thief, Marshal," Thomas replied, his gaze unwavering. "The law must be applied equally. You refuse to protect the property of the miller from assault. You refuse to investigate the sabotage of the dam. You applied the law only when the powerful felt inconvenienced. We did what the law failed to do, restore peace and deter crime." The marshal, aware of the public opinion that favored the Kincaids, knew the warrant would not hold up. He was caught between the judge's gavel, the rule of law, and the outlaw's hand, the execution of justice. The marshal looked at the lantern, the persistent symbol of the Kincaids' integrity. He crumpled the warrant in his hand. "Get the outlaw out of my territory, Kincaid," the marshal warned. "If I find him, I will hang him." "He is gone, Marshal," Thomas confirmed. "His work here is finished. The peace is restored." The marshal rode away, defeated by the messy yet effective application of prairie justice. That night, Caleb explained the final part of Thorne's payment. Thorne hadn't taken the full sum. He had left a small buckskin bag under the Kincaid's porch. Inside was a handful of silver coins and a note. "The hand only takes what is earned. The real payment is peace. Use the rest for the miller's new drill." JT the outlaw's hand had enforced the justice that the judge's gavel could not, and in doing so had paradoxically protected the hard-won integrity of Cedar Valley. The Kincaids had compromised their principles, but their community was safe. The tariff was secure, and the truth of the bartered land had been protected, not by the law, but by a higher, harsher code of the West. The peace had been bought, and the cost was recorded only in the weary eyes of Thomas Kincaid. The dust and the reckoning. The summer that followed the clash between the outlaw's hand and the judge's gavel promised prosperity, but delivered peril. The guaranteed long-term fair tariff, GLFT, was in hand, the stock pool was robust, and the first shipment of cattle was scheduled for the newly constructed railhead in late August. For the first time, Cedar Valley dared to breathe a collective sigh of hope. But the West held its own grim memory, and nature rarely forgave those who grew complacent. The first warning was the wind, which by mid-July no longer brought the scent of rain, but the dry, acrid smell of the desert. The long-predicted drought had arrived, silent and relentless. The retreat of the water, the Kincaid family's ingenious irrigation system, designed by Samuel, was the first line of defense. It drew water from the protected river parcel on the Kyle land, successfully channeling it to the turkey red wheat and the main grazing areas. The collective wisdom of the scholar and the soil had saved them from the initial heat. However, the sheer severity of the drought soon overwhelmed human ingenuity. The entire region surrounding Cedar Valley was parched. By early August, the river itself, the lifeblood of the valley, began to shrink. What was once a steady flowing stream became a sluggish, muddy trickle, barely enough to fill Samuel's diversion dam, let alone sustain the entire valley. The water shortage was not just a natural disaster, it was a moral reckoning. The farmers who had not joined the stock pool, the few remaining holdouts who distrusted the cooperative and modernization, were now desperate. Their reliance on traditional methods and the natural flow of the river had failed them entirely. They saw the precious dwindling water being channeled by the dam onto the pool's fields. Mr. Peterson, the old farmer who had resisted Samuel's dam, led the charge. He and a few others approached Thomas, their faces drawn with thirst and despair. "Thomas, you must open the dam," Peterson pleaded, his voice cracking. "The river flows to all. Your boy's system is hoarding the common water. Our wheat is dying." Thomas was torn. The dam was legally justified and was the result of massive communal effort, protecting the livelihood of 30 families. But the sight of his neighbors' dying fields and desperate faces was a searing indictment of his prosperity. "The water is being used efficiently, Peterson," Thomas argued, pointing to the river. "There is simply no water left to flow freely. If we break the dam, the water will sink into the dry soil before it reaches your field, and we will lose the stock pool's feed as well. We must ration this water to save the most crops. Rationing is for the righteous," Peterson shouted, his eyes blazing with accusation. "Your family has prospered while we suffer. You won the land with a trick, secured the peace with an outlaw, and now you hoard the last of God's water with a dam. This is not decency, Thomas. This is tyranny." The crisis of conscience. The accusation of tyranny struck Thomas Kincaid hard. He had spent his life fighting for the ideal of the unfinished West, a place of decency and equality. Had he and his children, in their efficient, determined defense against the syndicate, become exactly what they fought against? Wealthy manipulators who prioritized profit over people? That night, the Kincaid family debated the core of their victory. "The dam stays, Papa," Eliza stated firmly. "If we break it, we lose the stock pool. We lose the tariff. And Vance buys the whole valley for a pittance in the fall. The reckoning for their poor planning cannot be the ruin of the entire cooperative. But the truth is, Elle, we are saved only because we had the money to build the dam on Cale's federally secured land," Caleb pointed out grimly. "They are right, we used every tool, including the outlaw's hand, to build our wall. And now the wall is keeping out not just Vance, but our starving neighbors." Samuel, the scholar, offered a desperate scientific solution. "The water flow is almost zero. We need to focus on what we can save. We can't save the wheat, but we can save the rootstock and the people. We need to use the last of the river water solely for drinking and the most essential stock pool cattle feed." Thomas walked outside carrying the lantern. He walked past the parched yard, past the healthy glow of the turkey-red wheat, toward the river. He found Elias Cale, Jr., standing sentinel near the dam, rifle in hand, protecting the last of the water. "I won't let them break it, Thomas," Elias said, his eyes scanning the darkness. "You won't have to." "Elias," Thomas said, shaking his head. "If we win the tariff but lose the soul of this valley, we've still failed." Thomas made the agonizing decision. He did not break the dam, but he made a deal with his conscience and his children. Every ounce of excess food and water they possessed would be shared with the desperate non-pool members. The next day, Eliza and Sarah began the agonizing process of rationing. They gave out their dried beans, their preserved vegetables, and even their precious, expensive store of salted pork. The gesture was met not with gratitude, but with grudging acceptance. It was a temporary bandage on a mortal wound. The judgment of the dust, the true reckoning, arrived 3 days later. The sky, which had been a clear, scorching blue, began to take on a strange, coppery hue. The wind, which had been constant, suddenly dropped into an ominous silence. The air grew heavy, static, and still. Then the world turned red. A massive cyclonic dust storm, a terrifying phenomenon born of the decade of overplowing and drought, swept across the entire prairie. It was not mere dust. It was the topsoil of the finished West, lifted into the sky and hurled back down as a terrifying, blinding tempest. The storm lasted 3 agonizing hours. The wind howled with a sound like a tortured beast. The dust was so fine and dense that it penetrated every crack, every seam, covering the Kincaid's interior in a thick, choking coat of rusty red silt. The lantern, burning inside the house, cast only a weak, muffled orange glow, a tiny, vulnerable light against the immense geological violence outside. The storm was a judgment on everyone, on the Kincaid's temporary prosperity, on the traditional farmers' outdated methods, and on Vance's reckless exploitation of the land. The aftermath of the storm. When the storm finally passed, an eerie, profound silence returned. The valley was unrecognizable. The air was heavy, the light muted, and the ground was covered in a deep, uneven blanket of fine, red dust. The devastation was absolute. Crops. The exposed wheat fields of the non-pool members were buried and stripped bare. Even the protected turkey red wheat, while not completely destroyed, was heavily damaged, its growth stunted by the abrasive dust. The yield would be catastrophically low. Water. The dust had settled into the river, choking the already low flow and rendering what water remained thick and undrinkable. The dam was clogged with silt. Livestock, the cattle, unable to filter the fine dust, were coughing and sickly. Several of the younger calves were dead. The health of the entire stock pool herd was compromised. The economic reality hit Thomas like a physical blow. The first shipment, the one that would secure their finances and validate their tariff, was now impossible. They did not have the healthy cattle, nor the necessary feed. As Thomas, Eliza, and Caleb surveyed the damage, they found Mr. Peterson sitting on the ruined remnants of his porch. He was defeated, not angry. "It took all of us," Peterson whispered, scooping up a handful of the red dust. "The dust and the Lord took all of us. No more talk of dams and tariffs, Thomas. We are all equal now, equally ruined." The reckoning of the truth. The reckoning was not just in the loss of crops, it was in the loss of time. The cattle shipment was due in 10 days. If the stock pool failed to deliver the agreed-upon quantity, the syndicate would seize the opportunity to void the GLFT contract, claiming breach of terms. Vance would win by default. Eliza, seeing the despair of the community and the broken spirit of her father, took charge with a fierce, cold resolve. The contract requires a healthy herd, Caleb, which we do not have, and it requires feed, which we cannot grow, Eliza stated. But we have something Vance thinks is worthless. Knowledge. She looked at Samuel. How long until the water is filtered enough to drink? And how long until we can get enough feed to stabilize the cattle? Samuel, already working at the clogged dam, his spectacles fogged with silt, replied, 2 weeks to clear the dam and trenches. 3 weeks until the remaining wheat is processed for emergency silage. Too late for the August delivery. Eliza looked at her father. We cannot deliver the cattle, Papa, but we can deliver the truth. Thomas immediately understood. You mean the faulty charter map? The one we promised not to use for financial gain? We are not using it for gain, Papa, Eliza explained, her eyes fixed on the distant, silent rail line. We are using it to buy time for survival. If we break the contract, Vance wins. If we threaten him with the map, we force him to grant us an extension. Complete. They had to embrace the gray areas of the West to survive. They sent a single, terse telegram to Mr. Winston's stock pool delivery. Postponed due to acts of God. Failure to grant immediate 30-day extension. Will result in filing of federal trespass claims per Kincaid evidence. Respond by noon tomorrow. It was a bluff backed by a documented threat. The next morning, Winston's reply arrived via a frantic lone rider. Blackwood Syndicate grants 30-day grace period due to unforeseen natural events. Delivery must be completed by September 30th. No further extension. Vance had chosen to compromise rather than risk the public exposure of his defective charter, buying Cedar Valley 30 days of life. The community had survived the dust and the reckoning. They had lost their purity, but they had gained their survival. As Thomas Kincaid looked at his ruined fields, he knew the lantern was no longer a symbol of pristine morality, but of stubborn, compromised endurance. They had 30 days to clean the water, heal the herd, and rebuild the spirit of the valley. The fight for the unfinished West had just gotten dirtier, but it was far from over. Echoes of the old country. The 30-day extension secured from the Blackwood Syndicate was not a reprieve. It was a deadline measured in sweat and despair. Cedar Valley was buried under the red dust, the water was fouled, and the cattle were sickly. The community, battered by the drought and the subsequent reckoning, was on the brink of fracturing under the sheer weight of the impossible task ahead. Thomas Kincaid, the man who had always believed in the unifying power of the American ideal, found the community now retreating into its smaller, more familiar groups. The farmers began speaking their ancestral languages, clinging to the solace of the past. The English of the town hall and the ledger books gave way to the sharp cadence of Swedish, the melodic lilt of German, and the hard, resilient grammar. of the Irish. The very foundation of the unfinished West at the melting pot of a shared future was threatening to dissolve into the echoes of the old country. The call of the past, the Kincaids were Anglo-Saxon stock, their traditions rooted in the strict, pragmatic ethics of the eastern coast. But Cedar Valley was a mosaic of immigrants who had come to the West escaping famine, persecution, and hopelessness. Eliza, seeing the low spirits and the slow pace of the cleanup, realized the farmers were overwhelmed by the present. They needed more than logic and schedules. They needed a reason to believe in the communal future, a reason that resonated deeper than the promise of a tariff. "They are returning to the old ways, Papa," Eliza observed, watching the Swedish contingent quietly working their land, singing ancient, melancholic folk songs in a language she did not understand. "They are seeking comfort in what they left behind." Comfort is natural when everything modern. The dam, the contract, the rail line has failed them, Thomas sighed, his hands raw from days spent clearing silt from the irrigation trenches. "They seek the strength of the tribe, the strength of the old country." Samuel, ever the pragmatist, was focused on the technical challenge. He had devised a filtration system, a series of trenches layered with gravel, sand, and charcoal, to purify the last of the river water. But the labor was immense, and the morale was low. "We need 2 more teams on the filtration beds, Father," Samuel urged. "But the Swedish families won't work with the German families after that dispute over the grazing rights last spring. They are divided." The currency of culture, Eliza made a decision. If logic and economic necessity had failed to bridge the cultural gaps, she would use the currency of culture to reunite them. She approached the miller, the most respected member of the German community, a man known for his practical skill and deep memory of the past. "The filtration system is stalling, Mr. Miller," Eliza said. "It requires precisely sifted sand and charcoal. We need the efficiency and skill of the entire community working together." "They are too busy mourning their past, Eliza," the miller replied, his accent thick with the language of his youth. "We came here to build a new life, but the soil has rejected us." "Perhaps the old country had the better sense." "The old country had the sense to survive, Mr. Miller," Eliza countered gently. "They survived famine, war, and plague. They used knowledge passed down through generations. Is there not a way they prepared for disaster in the past? A song, a story, a specific task that unified them?" The miller paused, rubbing the flour dust from his beard. In the old villages, when the river ran foul or the well dried, the women would gather to clean the great communal cistern. They would bring their Heimat, their sense of home, to the work. They would sing the cleaning song, a powerful rhythmic song that sets the pace for the labor. Eliza nodded. "Then that is what we need. Not a command from the town hall, but a cleaning song for the cistern of the prairie." The night of the gathering, Eliza and Thomas spent the next few days not on their fields, but visiting every isolated homestead. They didn't talk about the tariff or the syndicate. They talked about memory. They asked the Swedish contingent about their festivals, the Irish about their wakes, and the Germans about their leader, songs. They organized a communal evening gathering at the town hall, not a meeting, but a celebration of survival. The only payment required was a story, a song, or a tradition from the old country. The night arrived, tentative and strange. The town hall was lit not just by the Kincaid's lantern, prominently placed by the door, but by dozens of lanterns brought by the immigrant families, different shapes, different styles, each carrying its own history. The air was hesitant until old Mr. Peterson, the man who had bitterly opposed the dam, stood up. He was Irish, and he began to recite an ancient mournful poem about the long voyage across the sea, the sorrow of leaving the green shores for the dry, red dust. The poem, heavy with shared loss, resonated deeply. Then the Swedish families brought out their fiddles. The music was bright, fast, and fiercely defiant, a polska that seemed to mock the dust and the drought. The young people, including Sven, the miller's son, began to dance, their joy a sudden, startling blast of life in the quiet room. Finally, the miller rose. He clapped his hands and began to sing the Reinigungslied, the cleaning song, a deep, resonant German work song, its rhythm perfectly suited for heavy, repetitive labor. The women of the German community immediately joined in, their voices weaving a rich, harmonizing tapestry of cultural strength. The song was beautiful, but its effect was entirely practical. It was a rhythm for working, the united effort the next morning. The cultural celebration was seamlessly translated into efficient, unified labor. The German women, singing the rhythmic cleaning song, began sifting the sand and charcoal for the filtration system, their hands moving with precise, practiced speed. The men, galvanized by the Irish memory of shared struggle and the Swedish music of defiance, organized themselves into teams. Crucially, the Swedish and German teams, still speaking their own languages, were now working side by side on the trenches. The cultural echoes had provided the rhythm and the reason for the labor. They were no longer the Kincaids, the Millers, or the Andersons. They were the collective survivors of the dust and the reckoning. Eliza, working with Samuel at the filtration site, noticed the incredible efficiency. The men and women, relying on ingrained, ancestral knowledge of physical labor and organization, worked faster and more harmoniously than any schedule Eliza could have devised. The traditional way wasn't wrong, Samuel noted, watching the seamless cooperation. It was just incomplete. My science provided the filter. Their culture provided the power to build it. Caleb, meanwhile, used his newly acquired ranching contacts to secure a crucial, unexpected lifeline. He returned with a massive wagon load of alfalfa hay, expensive, nutrient-rich feed sourced from a rancher far north who had survived the drought. This feed, paid for with the remaining silver from Jesse Thorne and Sarah's redeemed locket, would be the critical stopgap to nurse the sick cattle back to health. The true American identity as the deadline approached, the valley was transformed. The filtration system was working, providing clean, albeit rationed water. The cattle, fed with the nutrient-rich alfalfa, were recovering quickly. The communal effort had turned the impossible into the merely difficult. Thomas Kincaid stood on the porch, watching the last vestiges of the dust being washed away by a weak, welcome rainfall. He watched the Swedish workers and the German workers sharing a midday meal, communicating not with perfect English, but with gestures, shared laughter, and a common purpose. The West isn't finished. Thomas said, his voice imbued with a newfound understanding. Not because we haven't built the rail lines or settled the land. It's unfinished because the American identity itself is still being made. He looked at the lantern, which symbolized their integrity. I thought the light should be a single, pure white flame, the light of the American ideal. But look at them, The light is strong because it's made up of 1,000 different colors, the echoes of the old country, all burning together, protecting the new ground. Eliza smiled, watching her brother Caleb and Elias Cale, Jr. ride out to prepare the herd for the final drive. She held the contract, the symbol of their economic future, in her hand. The old country had given them the strength to survive the dust and the reckoning. Now, the combined force of scholar and soil, outlaw's hand and judge's gavel, would ride out to meet the iron horse one last time. They were no longer victims of the West, but its defiant, complex, and united masters. The final challenge, the actual delivery of the recovered herd, awaited them. The breaking of the dawn barrier. The morning of September 29th arrived cold and clear, the air washed clean by the recent rain. This was the day of reckoning. The 30-day extension secured from the Blackwood Syndicate was set to expire at midnight, and the Cedar Valley Stock Pool Cooperative had to deliver its consignment of 200 cattle to the railhead, 5 miles west of the valley. The deadline felt like a final, immutable barrier. The last hurdle between the community's hard-won stability and the syndicate's permanent economic control. The delivery had to be perfect, the count accurate, the cattle healthy, and the timing flawless. The dawn barrier, the entire community gathered at the Kyle homestead before sunrise. The pooled herd, thinned slightly by the drought but now strong and healthy thanks to the alfalfa feed and Samuel's careful management, was restless. The air thrummed with unspoken anxiety and fierce determination. Caleb Kincaid, the most experienced drover, led the effort. He and Elias Cale, Jr., mounted on their best horses, were positioned at the front and flanks of the herd. Eliza, mounted on the family's sturdy work mare, rode near the middle carrying the precious documents, the Guaranteed Long-Term Fair Tariff, GLFT contract, the official cattle count, and the contingency plan, the now infamous Kincaid map of Vance's defective charter. Thomas Kincaid, too old for the rigors of the drive, remained at the homestead with Sarah and Samuel, their duties now being to maintain the infrastructure and ensure the community's home defense. Before they departed, Thomas lifted the lantern. He had polished the brass to a mirror sheen, and the glass flue was spotless. The flame burned brighter and steadier than ever before, fueled by clean oil and years of resolve. "The barrier is not the distance, children," Thomas told them, his voice ringing with paternal authority. "The barrier is doubt. It is the last great fear that Vance will break us, that the West will betray us. You carry the future of this valley on the backs of those beasts. Go forward and let the light of your integrity break the dawn barrier." With that blessing, Caleb gave the signal. The herd began to move, their hooves kicking up the revitalized, damp soil. They moved not with the chaotic panic of loose cattle, but with the disciplined pace of a managed collective. The railhead ambush. The 5-mile drive was grueling but uneventful, a silent, tense march toward destiny. Eliza's anxiety peaked only when they reached the final stretch, the newly laid tracks of the Iron Horse where the syndicate had built its loading pens. Mr. Winston, the syndicate's local representative, was waiting, impeccably dressed and radiating cold hostility. With him were 2 inspectors and 4 of Vance's guards, new faces, armed and grim. "You are late, Miss Kincaid," Winston announced, consulting his pocket watch, though the sun had barely cleared the horizon. "The contract specifies delivery must be completed by midnight tonight. We have only 12 hours to inspect, load, and manifest." "We are precisely on time, Mr. Winston," Eliza countered, dismounting with a grace that belied her fatigue. "The contract states delivery must commence with sufficient time for inspection and loading. The process is beginning now." The inspection began immediately, and it was deliberately obstructionist. The inspectors, following Winston's obvious directive, were meticulously slow, citing minor blemishes and demanding unnecessary recounts. "This steer is underweight," one inspector declared, "kicking a healthy bullock. This branding mark is unclear," another complained, though the mark was perfectly clean. Every delay was a pressure point. Every complaint was designed to eat away at the remaining hours, pushing the cooperative closer to the midnight deadline, and therefore closer to breach of contract. Winston approached Eliza, his voice a low, threatening murmur. "We commend your tenacity, Miss Kincaid, but the truth is your cattle have suffered. They are a weak herd. If you fail to meet the exact agreed count and weight, the contract is void. Vance will be happy to buy your remaining land deeds for pennies on the dollar." Eliza looked him straight in the eye. "We will meet the contract, Mr. Winston, every single head, every single pound. The echoes of the old country taught us endurance." The quiet counter-strike. As the hours dragged on, Caleb and Eliza watched the process with growing dread. At the current rate, the inspection alone would take until midnight, leaving no time for the loading, a clear breach they knew Winston would exploit. Eliza knew Winston had a clear advantage: time. She had to break his control of the clock. She nodded to Caleb. Caleb, understanding the signal, slipped away to the rail cars. Using his ranching experience, he quickly noticed a structural flaw in the syndicate's new loading ramp, a critical beam that was visibly cracked. Caleb returned to Eliza. "The ramp is unsound. It's too dangerous to load the cattle. It needs a repair." Eliza immediately confronted Winston. "Mr. Winston, your loading ramp is structurally defective. We cannot risk our livestock on an unsafe platform. We require you to halt the inspection and repair the ramp immediately using your on-site tools." Winston smirked. "Nonsense. The ramp is new. You are attempting to stall the inspection to buy time." "We are attempting to protect our property from your negligence," Eliza shot back. If the ramp collapses, the syndicate is liable for the full loss of the herd per the contract's indemnity clause. Do you wish to risk the entire 200 head, Mr. Winston? Winston knew the indemnity clause was real. A collapsed ramp, regardless of the contract's outcome, would mean a massive, immediate payout. Reluctantly, he ordered the inspection halted and diverted 2 of his own guards, the only men with the necessary tools, to repair the ramp. Eliza had successfully flipped the switch. She had turned the syndicate's own need for liability protection into a stall tactic, buying her invaluable time. The final bargain, the critical moment, came at 4 p.m. The ramp was repaired, the inspection resumed, and the countdown was still dangerously tight. As the second-to-last car was being filled, one of the inspectors, following Winston's final instruction, pulled out a small, pre-written notice. "Inspection complete," the inspector announced, handing the notice to Eliza. "The final count is 199 head. We are short by 1. The contract is regrettably void due to failure to deliver the precise quantity stipulated." The air went silent. The farmers watching from the ridge gasped. 1 single steer. The loss of 1 animal in the chaos of the drought was enough for Vance to void the entire hard-won GLFT. Winston smiled. A triumphant, cruel gesture. "A disappointing failure, Miss Kincaid," Winston purred. "But business is business. The contract is void. We will buy the remaining cattle from you now at the market rate, and you will sign an acknowledgement of breach." Eliza felt the crushing weight of 2 years of struggle, compromise, and sacrifice descend upon her. The lantern's light, the stock pool's unity, Caleb's integrity, Samuel's science, all negated by the loss of 1 single animal. But Eliza had one final card, one that only she, Thomas, and Caleb knew existed: the Kincaid map. She looked at Winston, her eyes blazing with the quiet fire of the town hall. "The contract is not void, Mr. Winston," Eliza said, her voice steady and lethal. "We will deliver the final steer, but we require a final amendment to the GLFT." Winston laughed. "You are in breach, Miss Kincaid. You have no leverage." "I have leverage that will shut down your entire rail line by filing a federal trespass claim this evening," Eliza declared, pulling the yellowed map from her satchel. "You know this map is not a bluff. If we are in breach, you will be in criminal violation of federal land use statutes, and the fine will be retroactive for every single ton you have ever hauled." Winston's face went pale. He hadn't expected the map to resurface. He knew Eliza would follow through. She was no longer a farmer's daughter, but a calculated threat. "What is your amendment?" Winston whispered, defeated. Eliza slid a piece of paper, an amendment she had written days ago, across the table. "The contract requires a guarantee of fair rates." "But not a guarantee of fair service," Eliza explained, tapping the paper. "My amendment is simple. For the remainder of the 5-year term, the Blackwood Syndicate will provide the Cedar Valley stock pool with free, round-trip transport of all grain and feed purchased outside the territory, a service crucial to surviving the drought. This was a brilliant economic maneuver, a trade of 1 missing steer for a permanent, free supply chain, a guarantee of survivability against future droughts." Winston stared at the paper. The cost of a few rail cars of feed was minuscule compared to the potential federal fine and the stoppage of his entire line. He had to concede. He scrawled his signature below the amendment. "You are an impossible woman, Miss Kincaid." The final steer Eliza tucked the amended contract safely away. "The delivery is complete, Mr. Winston, but you are still short 1 steer." Winston spat, clinging to his last point of control. Eliza smiled. She turned to the loading pen and clapped her hands. A moment later, Caleb Kincaid led out the final steer. It was not a bullock or a heifer. It was the Kincaid's own milch cow, a beloved, productive animal named Bessie, who provided the family's daily milk. Bessie was the 200th animal. "The contract states cattle, Mr. Winston," Eliza said, her voice heavy with the true cost of their victory. "Bessie is cattle. She fulfills the contract." Winston stared at the beautiful, gentle cow, then back at the triumphant, broken faces of the farmers watching. The Kincaids had literally given up a piece of their sustenance, their home life, to fulfill the contract, denying him his breach. Defeated utterly, Winston could only watch as Bessie was loaded onto the last car. The dawn barrier was broken, not by grand violence, but by tenacious legality and heartbreaking sacrifice. As the sun set, the train pulled away, carrying the stock pool's first successful consignment toward the east. Eliza stood alone on the tracks. Caleb walked up, his eyes resting on the spot where Bessie had stood. "We won, El," he said, his voice hollow. "But we paid so much." Eliza looked back toward Cedar Valley. The lantern was now riding back on the empty wagon, Thomas and Samuel bringing it home. "The cost was high, Caleb," Eliza agreed, watching the light grow closer. "But we didn't just save the valley from the syndicate. We saved it from doubt and division. The victory is not the contract. It's the fact that after the dust, the shame, and the threats, the community still signed as one. That integrity, Caleb, is the unextinguishable light. The unextinguishable light, the delivery was complete." Bessie, the Kincaids' beloved milch cow, was on a train bound for the eastern markets, the final, heartbreaking price paid to secure the guaranteed long-term fair tariff, GLFT, and the crucial free feed amendment. The dawn barrier had been broken, not by force, but by a final, resolute act of sacrifice and a masterfully deployed legal threat. The train smoke faded on the horizon, leaving behind a silence more profound than any drought or blizzard. Cedar Valley had won the war for economic survival, but the victory felt heavy. Stained by the difficult choices made, consorting with an outlaw, sacrificing pure principles, and giving up a piece of their very home life. Now came the reckoning of peace, the need to reconcile the hard-won practical victory with the Kincaid family's original, uncompromising moral vision of the unfinished West. The return of the symbol, when Thomas Kincaid drove the empty wagon back to the homestead, the first thing he did was carefully lift the lantern from its seat. He carried it inside, placed it on the mantel, and then, with a heavy sigh, he extinguished the flame. "It is done," he said simply to Sarah, Eliza, and Caleb, who were silently gathered. "The contract is signed. The tariff is secure. The peace is paid for. The fight is over." Sarah Kincaid, the woman who had longed for the stability of the East, stepped forward. She looked at the blackened wick, then at the empty brass reservoir. "The fight is never over, Thomas," she said, her voice unexpectedly strong. She walked to the deed box, removed her locket, which the Andersons had insisted on redeeming and returning, and placed it gently next to the extinguished lamp. "The lamp can only light the path. It cannot walk it. You put out the light, but the integrity it symbolized still remains. That is what needs to burn now." Her words cut through the exhaustion. Thomas realized he had confused the symbol with the substance. He had relied so heavily on the visible light of the lantern to justify his actions that, now that the immediate crisis was past, he felt his moral reserves were empty. Reconciling the compromises, the community, having secured its future, faced its own internal reckoning. The non-pool members, Peterson and the others who had opposed the dam and hoarded their resources, were now entirely dependent on the cooperative. Their fields were ruined, and they needed feed, seeds, and the low tariffs of the GLFT to survive the next year. At the final stock pool cooperative meeting, the debate was fierce. Some members, remembering the harshness of the drought and Peterson's accusations, argued for retribution. "They called us thieves, and they tried to break our dam," Jonas the blacksmith roared. "They chose to stay outside the unity. They should pay the high market rate for our turkey red seed." Eliza, who had masterminded the victory, stood before the group. She was the one who had made the hardest choices, and she alone could articulate the final, necessary compromise. "We won this tariff not just because of the map or the money," Eliza stated, holding the amended contract. "We won because of unity. We stood as one against Vance. If we now punish our neighbors, we become what Vance is, an oppressor who uses their power to crush the weak." She invoked the spirit of the lantern. "The light must be unextinguishable, not just for us, but for the entire valley. We offer them membership in the stock pool now. With one condition: they pay their back dues not in money, but in labor, helping us repair the damage the dust storm did to the irrigation system. It was a final, brilliant compromise, an offer of redemption through service. They would save the non-pool members, but only in exchange for their commitment to the communal infrastructure. The vote was close, but the spirit of unity, forged in the echoes of the old country, ultimately prevailed. The scholar's new blueprint, Samuel Kincaid, the scholar, found his own peace by moving beyond the immediate crisis to the long-term future. He realized that the greatest threat to Cedar Valley was not Vance, but the relentless dust and the reckoning of the environment. He presented the community with a new blueprint for the unfinished West, a plan for sustainable survival that would make them truly independent of market whims and environmental disasters. Windbreak shelters, planting extensive rows of juniper and cedar trees, the namesake of the valley, along the western perimeter to break the wind and prevent future dust storms. Deep water wells, using advanced geological surveying, knowledge learned in the East, to locate and drill deeper, more reliable artesian wells, ending their reliance on the shrinking river. The shared silo, constructing a massive, communal silo on the kale land for silage storage, ensuring that the winter feed supply could never again be compromised. The community, now educated by the bitter lessons of the spring, embraced Samuel's scientific vision. The former holdouts, led by Peterson, began repaying their debt to the community by digging the first post holes for the windbreaks. The true cost of peace, the personal costs, however, lingered. Thomas Kincaid found himself alone one afternoon, staring at the empty, dark lantern. He was struggling with the decision to hire Jesse Thorne, the outlaw. Suddenly, Caleb appeared, holding a freshly crafted wooden box. "It's for Bessie, Papa," Caleb said, his voice quiet. A way to remember her. She was a good cow. Caleb sat beside his father. "I did what I had to do with Thorne. I did it because the judge's gavel was bought, and I couldn't stand by and watch the whole valley collapse. You taught me the ideal, Papa. But the West taught me that sometimes, to preserve the ideal, you need a rough hand to clear the path." Thomas looked at the box, then at his son. He realized that Caleb had embraced the harsh reality so that Thomas himself would not have to. Caleb was the keeper of the valley's defense, allowing Thomas to remain the keeper of its soul. "The shame of the outlaw's hand is mine, son," Thomas admitted finally. "And the burden of the bartered land is shared. But the trust, that remains clean, the unextinguishable light. The true meaning of the unextinguishable light was revealed months later. It was early spring, and the newly drilled artesian well, guided by Samuel's precise calculations, struck water. The cool, clean, steady water flowed freely, symbolizing a permanent end to the drought anxiety. That night, the entire community gathered at the site of the new well. Thomas Kincaid stood before them. He held the lantern, now completely restored, its brass gleaming. "I extinguished the flame after the drive," Thomas admitted, holding the lamp high, "because I felt that the difficult choices we made had rendered the light dishonest. I thought integrity required purity." He looked out at the faces weathered by dust, fatigue, and compromise, yet now shining with resilience. "But this past year has taught me that the light is not extinguished by the mud, the greed, or the difficult choice. The light is extinguished only by giving up. We stood by a criminal, we bartered a contract, and we sacrificed our livelihood. But we did it not for profit, but for each other. We did it to honor the promise of a decent life in this hard land." Thomas turned to Samuel. "Samuel's science gave us water." He turned to Eliza. "Eliza's knowledge gave us economic freedom." He turned to Caleb. "Caleb's protection gave us peace." He took a fresh match and, with deliberate care, relit the wick. The flame caught, bright and strong. "The lantern that kept burning is not just an oath to be decent," Thomas concluded, the light bathing his face. "It is the living, working symbol of the Cedar Valley Cooperative, the combined strength of every tradition, every science, and every painful compromise made for the sake of the collective. It is the proof that the West will be built not by robber barons, but by united people who refuse to let the darkness prevail. The light was no longer just the Kincaid symbol. It was the emblem of the entire valley. It burned steadily, proving that integrity was not found in avoidance of conflict, but in the tenacious resolve to fight for a better future, even with soiled hands. The unextinguishable light was the shared, resilient spirit of the finished cooperative that finally conquered the unfinished West.